Welcome to Whispering Willow Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The morning light filtered through the grimy window of 221B Baker Street, with the hesitance of something uninvited, illuminating dust motes that dance like tiny ghosts in the stale air. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless at that window, his long fingers pressed against the glass, leaving faint prints that would fade as quickly as the fog outside seemed determined to linger. The scent of old tobacco clung to the room's corners, mingling with the faint metallic tang of chemical experiments abandoned on the cluttered table. Watson sat in his usual chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him as he turned the pages of the Times. But his eyes kept drifting upward to his friend's silhouette, observing the particular quality of stillness that meant Holmes's mind was both everywhere and nowhere at once. "The fog has been with us for 17 days, Holmes said, his voice carrying that distant quality it took when he was thinking aloud, rather than speaking to anyone in particular. 17 days of London wrapping itself in grey wool, of streets that smell of coal and dampness, of cases that blur together like ink on wet paper. Watson set down his newspaper, the rustle seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "You're restless." "I am something," Holmes replied, turning from the window at last. His face, angular and sharp, even in the diffused morning light, held an expression Watson had learned to recognize over their years together. Not quite discontent, but a wearing thin of patience with the city's relentless sameness. Though restless implies energy-seeking direction, I feel rather more like a violin string that has been played the same note for so long it has forgotten it was designed for melody. It was precisely this sort of metaphor, delivered with such casual melancholy, that made Watson reach for his pen some evenings, trying to capture his friend's peculiar poetry in words that might do it justice. But this morning he set aside the impulse to document, and instead said something he had been considering for several days, ever since the fog had turned from atmospheric to oppressive. "Then perhaps," Watson ventured, "we might consider a brief exodus from this grey fortress. The coast, for instance. I hear Brighton is particularly pleasant in late spring." Holmes turned fully now, one eyebrow raised in that expression of mild surprise he wore when Watson said something unexpected. "Brighton?" "The sea air is therapeutic," Watson continued, warming to his idea now that it had been spoken aloud. "The boardwalk, the pavilion, the simple pleasure of watching waves perform their ancient repetition. No crimes, no mysteries, no London fog thick enough to cut with a knife and serve on toast." For a moment Holmes said nothing, and Watson prepared himself for the inevitable dismissal. The logical reasons why leaving London was impractical, the cases that might need attention, the boredom that would surely follow them to the coast like a persistent creditor. But then Holmes did something remarkable. He smiled, small and genuine, the kind of expression that transformed his entire face from its usual sharp calculation into something almost boyish. "Brighton," Holmes repeated, as if testing the word for hidden meanings. "Yes, Yes, Watson, I believe that might be exactly the remedy for what ails us both. When shall we depart?" "Tomorrow morning?" Watson suggested, half disbelieving his own success in this persuasion. "Tonight would be better," Holmes replied, already moving toward his room with renewed purpose. "I find that once a decision is made, delay only invites second-guessing, and second-guessing is the close cousin of regret. Mrs. Hudson will be delighted to have us gone for a few days. I believe my chemical experiments have been troubling her sense of domestic order." And so it was that by the following morning the two men found themselves at Victoria Station, standing amid the controlled chaos that characterized London's railway terminals in that late spring of 1892. The station's great arched roof stretched overhead like the ribcage of some industrial leviathan, trapping the sounds of whistles, shouts, and hissing steam in a cacophony that somehow felt less oppressive than the silence of Baker Street's fog-bound streets. The smell here was different too. Coal smoke, yes, but mixed with the oil of machinery, the leather of luggage, the perfume of ladies dressed for travel, the meat pies sold by vendors who wove between the crowds with the practiced ease of long experience. Holmes purchased their tickets, while Watson secured their modest luggage, and within the quarter hour they were settling into a second-class compartment as the train prepared for departure. The seats, upholstered in a burgundy fabric that had seen better days, nonetheless felt comfortable enough, and Watson positioned himself by the window, eager for that moment when the train would leave London behind and the landscape would shift from urban density to something approaching countryside. The whistle blew, sharp and authoritative, and the train lurched into motion with the reluctance of something very heavy being asked to move. Holmes sat across from Watson, his eyes already half closed, in that state of repose he could summon at will, though Watson knew better than to assume his friend was actually sleeping. More likely, Holmes was filing away observations from the platform, cataloguing fellow passengers, constructing elaborate theories about their lives based on nothing more than the cut of a coat or the mud on a shoe. As London began to slide past the window, first the grand buildings, then the smaller houses, then the industrial sprawl that marked the city's edges, Watson felt something in his chest loosen, a tightness he hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to release. He had not realized how much he had been carrying the weight of their recent cases, the parade of human misery and criminal ingenuity that made up their usual business. A solicitor's murdered wife, a blackmail scheme involving a cabinet minister, a theft of emeralds that had turned out to be paste, each case solved, each mystery unravelled. But somehow the satisfaction had begun to feel mechanical, like winding the same clock day after day. "You're thinking too much," Holmes observed without opening his eyes. "I can hear the gears turning from here." Watson chuckled. "And here? I thought you were napping." "I am doing both. It is a skill I have cultivated." Holmes opened one eye, regarding Watson with amused tolerance. "But truly, old friend, try to leave London behind us as the train does. The city will keep its secrets and crimes quite well in our absence. They have managed for centuries without our intervention, and will muddle through a few more days." "You're right, of course," Watson agreed, turning his attention back to the window, where London was indeed falling away now, replaced by the tentative green of fields and the occasional farmhouse, solid and eternal-looking against the morning sky. The journey to Brighton took just under 2 hours, and Watson spent most of it in that pleasant state between wakefulness and drowsiness, watching the English countryside perform its subtle transformation from the industrial to the pastoral and back again. They passed through small stations where the train barely paused, saw children waving from cottage gardens, observed the way the light changed as clouds moved across the sun like thoughts across a mind. Holmes remained in his meditative state, though occasionally he would make some small observation about a farmer's fence that needed mending, about the way crows gathered in a particular field, about the architectural style of a church spire glimpsed in the distance. It was Watson who first noticed the change in the air, that indefinable quality that announced the proximity of the sea before it could be seen or heard. Something about the light turned crystalline, the way it does when it has travelled across water before reaching land. The scent filtered in through the compartment's slightly opened window. Salt and brine and something ancient. The smell of tides that had been keeping their appointments since before humans built cities or invented clocks. "We're nearly there," Watson said, and felt foolish for stating the obvious. But Holmes merely nodded, sitting up straighter now, his own attention caught by the approaching coast. Brighton revealed itself gradually, as if shy about its own beauty. First came the outlying buildings, respectable Victorian terraces with their characteristic facades painted in whites and creams. Then the density increased, the architecture growing more elaborate, more confident in its decorative ambitions. Wrought iron balconies, bay windows that curved outward like curious eyes, decorative cornices that served no purpose but beauty. All of it speaking to Brighton's identity as a place that had transformed itself from fishing village to fashionable resort through sheer determination and the patronage of royalty. The Prince Regent's influence still hung over the town like expensive perfume, even though he had been dead for decades, and his exotic pavilion stood as a monument to excess rather than current fashion. But Brighton had absorbed that royal attention and made itself into something beyond any single patron's vision, a democratic seaside, where factory workers on holiday might walk the same promenade as lords, where the sea wind respected neither title nor income, where the fundamental human desire to stand at the edge of land and contemplate the infinite found equal expression in every social class. The train pulled into Brighton station with a long exhalation of steam, and Watson gathered their bags, while Holmes paid a porter a few coins to direct them to suitable lodgings. The porter, a wiry man with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life near the sea, recommended a boarding house on Brunswick Terrace. Clean, respectable, and the landlady don't ask too many questions about gentlemen's business, if you take my meaning. Holmes assured him they had no mysterious business to conduct, but the porter merely winked in the way of someone who had heard such assurances before and knew they meant precisely nothing. They emerged from the station into the full brightness of a late spring morning, and the contrast to London could not have been more complete. Where the capital was all angles and shadows, even in daylight, Brighton opened itself to the sky with an almost shameless enthusiasm. The air was cleaner, sharper, carrying that salt tang that made Watson want to breathe deeply just for the pleasure of it. Sounds travelled differently here, too. Instead of the muffled compression of city noise, everything seemed to carry clearly. From the cry of seagulls overhead to the distant sound of waves meeting shore, to the cheerful calls of flower sellers and newspaper boys. They walked through the town toward the seafront, their modest bags manageable enough that they eschewed a cab in favour of experiencing Brighton on foot. The streets were narrower than London's grand thoroughfares, but they curved and climbed in ways that felt organic rather than planned, as if the town had grown up around the contours of the land, rather than imposing geometric order upon it. Shop fronts advertised seaside necessities, bathing costumes, parasols, souvenir shells, postcards depicting the pier in optimistic watercolours that made it look even more romantic than reality. But reality, Watson thought as they turned a corner, and the sea suddenly revealed itself at the end of the street, was romantic enough. The English Channel spread before them in bands of blue and grey and green, the water catching the light in ways that changed from moment to moment. The beach was not sand, but pebbles, thousands upon thousands of smooth stones in shades of grey and cream and amber, making a sound like soft applause when the waves retreated across them. The famous pier extended into the water with Victorian confidence, its structure both sturdy and fanciful, promising entertainment and spectacle to anyone willing to pay the penny admission. The boarding house the porter had recommended proved to be exactly as advertised, clean, respectable, and presided over by a Mrs. Wickham, who examined them with the practised eye of a woman who had housed every type of visitor imaginable. Satisfied that they were gentlemen of reasonable character and adequate funds, she showed them to adjoining rooms on the second floor, both with windows that faced the sea. "Breakfast is at 8, dinner at 6, she informed them crisply. "No smoking in the bedrooms, no visitors after 10, and the front door locks at midnight. If you're planning to be out later than that, you'll need to make arrangements in advance. Will you be wanting bathing machines if you intend to swim?" Holmes assured her they had no immediate plans for sea bathing, and Mrs. Wickham departed with a nod that suggested she approved of their restraint. The room, once she had gone, revealed itself to be simply furnished, but comfortable. A bed with a brass frame, a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar, a washstand with a pitcher and basin in a blue willow pattern, and that glorious window through which the sea wind now entered, carrying with it all the promise of days unstructured by crime or fog or London's insistent demands. Watson moved to the window, leaning on the sill, breathing in that extraordinary air. Below, the promenade was already busy with morning walkers, families, couples, elderly gentlemen with canes, children darting between adults with the heedless energy of youth. The beach itself was dotted with the strange apparatus of Victorian seaside leisure, bathing machines like wooden boxes on wheels, waiting to be rolled into the surf to preserve modesty, striped tents offering shelter from sun or rain, vendors with carts selling whelks and winkles, rock candy and postcards, and underneath it all, constant and rhythmic, the sound of the sea itself, that ancient percussion that humans had been listening to since they first stood upright and walked to the water's edge. Wave after wave after wave, each one slightly different, each one essentially the same, a sound that seemed to say that while human concerns might feel urgent and overwhelming, the sea had been here before those concerns, and would remain long after they had resolved themselves or faded into memory. Watson heard Holmes moving about in the adjacent room, the sound of a wardrobe opening, the splash of water in a basin. They had agreed to unpack and refresh themselves before venturing out properly, though Watson found himself reluctant to step away from the window, as if the view might disappear if he stopped looking at it. But eventually, practicality asserted itself, and he turned to his modest luggage, hanging his spare suit in the wardrobe, arranging his shaving things on the washstand, placing his journal and pen on the small writing desk that stood against one wall. That journal would, he hoped, record something other than criminal proceedings for the next few days. Simple observations about sea light, about walking without destination, about the particular quality of rest that came from having nothing urgent to accomplish. From outside, drifting up through the open window, came a sound that Watson almost missed in the general orchestration of seaside noise. A cry, distant and wordless, carrying a note that seemed neither joyful nor distressed, but something in between. Something that hovered in the air for a moment before being absorbed by the larger sounds of Brighton going about its morning business. Watson paused in his unpacking, listening, but the sound did not repeat. Perhaps a gull, he thought, or a child at play. Nothing, certainly, that required investigation or concern. Nothing that should disturb the peaceful interlude they had come here to enjoy. And yet, as he returned to his unpacking, some small part of his mind held on to that sound, filing it away with the same instinct that had served him well in Afghanistan and later in London's darker corners. The instinct that suggested when something, however small, was not quite as it should be. But that was London thinking, he told himself firmly. Here, they were on holiday. Here, mysteries could remain mysteries, and strange sounds could simply be strange sounds, requiring nothing more than a moment's idle curiosity before being forgotten in favour of pastries and sea air, and the simple pleasure of walking without purpose along the promenade. Tomorrow, Watson thought, tomorrow we shall explore properly. For now, rest was enough, and the sound of waves and the light changing as clouds moved across the sun, painting the water in shades that no artist could truly capture, but that the eye drank in with grateful wonder. Dawn broke over Brighton with the gentle insistence of someone who knows they need not hurry, that their arrival is both expected and welcome. The darkness retreated, not in defeat, but in graceful acquiescence, pulling back across the English Channel like a curtain drawn by invisible hands. Watson woke to this transformation, his body responding to the light before his mind fully surfaced from sleep, and for a disorienting moment he could not place himself. The quality of sound was all wrong for Baker Street, too open, too rhythmic, and the air tasted of salt rather than coal smoke. Then memory assembled itself, and he smiled at the ceiling of Mrs. Wickham's boarding house, at the particular pleasure of waking somewhere new, with nothing required of him, except the mild effort of getting dressed and going downstairs for breakfast. Through the thin wall that separated his room from Holmes's, he could hear nothing, which meant his friend was either still deeply asleep, or had already risen and departed with that silent efficiency he employed when he wished to move unobserved. Watson rose and moved to the window, drawn by the light and the sound of the sea. The view rewarded his curiosity. The channel stretched before him in the early morning, its surface catching the dawn in shades of rose gold and pearl grey, the water moving with that eternal patience that made human urgency seem faintly ridiculous. The promenade below was not yet crowded, though already a few early risers walked its length. A man with a small dog that seemed outraged by the seagulls, an elderly woman in widow's black who moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones remembered different times, a young couple, walking close together with that particular self-containment of new love that made the rest of the world seem almost irrelevant to their existence. The beach itself was transformed by the low angle of light, each pebble casting its own tiny shadow, creating a texture that looked almost soft despite the stone's unyielding nature. The bathing machine stood silent and waiting, their wheels half buried in the stones, their painted wood weathered by salt and wind into a patina that no craftsman could deliberately create. Further out, the pier extended into the water like a promise, its structure both sturdy and fanciful, Victorian engineering dressed up in decorative confidence. Watson dressed in the casual clothes he had brought specifically for this journey, trousers and a shirt without the formal collar that London demanded, a jacket that had seen enough wear to be comfortable rather than presentable. He shaved carefully in the mirror above the washstand, noting that his face already looked different somehow, as if the sea air had begun its work even in the space of one night. Perhaps it was simply the quality of sleep he had managed, deep and uninterrupted by the sounds of London traffic, or the anxiety that someone might arrive at Baker Street with an urgent case requiring immediate attention. Downstairs, the dining room proved to be a modest space with 3 tables, 2 of which were already occupied. Mrs. Wickham presided over the morning meal with the efficiency of a general organizing troops, appearing from the kitchen with plates of eggs, bacon, toast, and kippers, each portion generous, without being excessive, each plate arriving at precisely the right temperature, to suggest it had been cooked moments before serving. Holmes was already seated at the table nearest the window, a cup of tea before him, and a contemplative expression on his face as he gazed out at the morning promenade. He looked, Watson thought, more relaxed than he had seen him in months, not entirely free of that particular intensity that characterized his friend's engagement with the world, but somehow the edges had softened, as if Brighton's sea air had indeed begun to work its therapeutic magic. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes said without turning from the window. "I trust you slept well? The sound of the waves is rather hypnotic once one surrenders to their rhythm." Watson took the seat across from him, accepting with gratitude the tea that Mrs. Wickham poured before disappearing back into her kitchen. "Like a child," he confirmed. "I cannot remember the last time I woke feeling so thoroughly rested. And you? Did you manage to resist the urge to deduce the life histories of our fellow lodgers based on their luggage and breakfast orders?" Holmes's mouth quirked in that small smile that meant Watson had caught him at precisely such activity. "Only minimally, but I am making a conscious effort to observe without drawing conclusions, to simply let the world exist without requiring it to make sense or reveal its secrets. It is," he added with theatrical melancholy, "surprisingly difficult." Their breakfast arrived then, and for several minutes they applied themselves to the meal with the appreciation of men who had grown accustomed to Mrs. Hudson's reliable but uninspired cooking. The eggs were perfectly done, the bacon crisp without being burnt, the toast achieving that ideal balance between soft interior and crunchy exterior that seemed simple but required genuine skill. The kippers, fresh from that morning's catch, tasted of the sea in the best possible way, their flesh flaking easily under fork pressure, their richness cut perfectly by the sharp English mustard Mrs. Wickham provided in a small ceramic pot. As they ate, Watson found his attention drawn repeatedly to the window and the scene beyond. Brighton was waking fully now, revealing itself as a town that had made itself into something quite specific and deliberate. Unlike London, which had grown organically over centuries, accumulating history and architecture and purpose in layers that could never be fully excavated or understood, Brighton had transformed itself within living memory from a modest fishing village into a fashionable resort town, and that transformation showed in every detail of its presentation. The buildings that lined the seafront were painted in shades that seemed chosen specifically to please the eye and lift the spirits, creams and whites and pale yellows that caught the morning light and reflected it back as if the town itself were smiling. The Regency architecture, with its characteristic bow windows and wrought iron balconies, spoke to a particular moment in English taste, when elegance and restraint were valued above Gothic excess or Victorian ostentation. Even the street lamps, now extinguished by the morning sun, had been designed with an eye toward beauty, rather than mere function, their posts decorated with flourishes that served no purpose, except to suggest that Brighton was a place where such details mattered. "The Prince Regent has much to answer for," Holmes observed, following Watson's gaze. His patronage in the early years of the century essentially invented this town as we see it now. Before his attention, Brighton was merely Brighthelmstone, a fishing village of no particular distinction. But royalty, as always, acts as a kind of permission. If the prince finds a place fashionable, then society follows, and where society goes, money and development are never far behind. Watson nodded, spreading marmalade on his toast with careful attention. And now it serves as a democratic resort, which I imagine the old prince would find either delightful or appalling depending on his mood. Factory workers and lords sharing the same promenade, breathing the same sea air, watching the same waves. The sea is the great equalizer, Holmes agreed. It doesn't care about one's bank balance or family connections. It simply performs its ancient work, moving according to the moon's dictates, eroding the shore stone by stone, claiming what it wishes and surrendering what it chooses. There is something almost restful in its indifference. They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, and by the time they emerged from Mrs. Wickham's establishment into the full brightness of the morning, Brighton had completed its transformation from sleeping town to active resort. The promenade that had been nearly empty at dawn now bustled with that particular energy of people on holiday, released temporarily from their usual routines and determined to extract pleasure from every available moment. Families moved in clusters, children darting ahead, while parents followed at a more measured pace, calling out warnings about not getting too close to the edge, about staying where they could be seen, about the importance of holding hands when crossing streets. The children, drunk on freedom and sea air, obeyed with varying degrees of compliance, their voices high and excited as they pointed out every gull, every wave, every interesting shop window, as if each were a discovery of profound importance. Couples walked in pairs, some young and self-conscious in their new intimacy, others older and comfortable with the settled silence of long companionship. Elderly gentlemen strolled with canes that tapped a rhythm against the promenade's paving stones, their faces turned toward the sun as if storing its warmth against future winters. Ladies in summer dresses and carrying parasols moved with that particular grace, that good posture, and restrictive undergarments enforced, their conversations carried on the breeze in fragments, and then she said, Absolutely shocking. The most divine hat. The vendors had established their positions along the promenade with the territorial certainty of regular occupation. A flower seller, her basket filled with roses and carnations, called out her wares in a voice that had learned to project without shouting. A man with a cart sold whelks and winkles, the smell of vinegar sharp and appetizing in the salt air. Another offered ice cream from an insulated container, the treats melting slowly in their cones as children licked them with focused determination, racing against the sun's warmth. Musicians had claimed strategic positions along the walking route. A violinist whose instrument sang with surprising sweetness despite the open air's tendency to steal sound. An accordion player whose instrument wheezed and sighed in three-quarter time. A young woman with a harp who seemed almost ethereal in her concentration, her fingers moving across the strings with the delicacy of someone painting with light. Holmes and Watson walked slowly, with no destination or purpose beyond experiencing Brighton itself. The morning sun was warm but not oppressive, that perfect late spring temperature that made movement pleasant rather than effortful. The channel spread before them in bands of colour that shifted with the light, turquoise near the shore, where the water was shallow, deepening to navy in the distances, with occasional patches of jade green, where the sun struck at particular angles. The beach itself was already dotted with visitors who had descended the steps from the promenade to walk among the pebbles. Some collected stones, examining each one before pocketing the most interesting or returning it to the general collection. Others simply stood at the water's edge, letting the waves approach and retreat, their shoes getting wet with that particular abandon that suggested they were not usually people who permitted their shoes to get wet, but had decided that Brighton was a place where usual rules might be temporarily suspended. The bathing machines were beginning their daily work, being pushed into the surf by strong men who seemed immune to the cold water that soaked their legs to the thigh. Ladies would enter these wooden boxes on wheels while they were still on shore, change into their bathing costumes in privacy, and then be wheeled into the water to a depth that preserved modesty, while allowing them to experience the sea. It was a peculiarly Victorian solution to the problem of how to allow women to swim while maintaining propriety, and watching the machines being positioned was like observing some strange marine creature being coaxed into its natural habitat. The English relationship with the sea is fascinating, Holmes mused, as they paused to lean against the promenade's railing, watching the bathing machine operation with the detached interest of observers who had no intention of participating. We are an island nation, shaped entirely by our proximity to water, our empire built on naval supremacy, our weather dictated by oceanic currents. And yet, we approach the sea with this combination of reverence and suspicion, as if we cannot quite decide whether it is friend or enemy. Perhaps it is both, Watson suggested. The sea provides, and the sea takes away. It feeds us and drowns us, connects us to the world, and isolates us from it. I suspect the English relationship with the sea is complicated precisely because the sea itself is complicated, too vast for simple feelings, too powerful for easy categorization. They continued their walk, moving past the Grand Hotel with its impressive facade, past the smaller lodging houses that advertised themselves with hand-painted signs, past shops selling everything a visitor might desire or suddenly decide they needed. The smell of fresh pastries drew them eventually to a bakery, whose window displayed an array of treats that made Watson's recent breakfast seem like distant memory. Cream buns and jam tarts, Chelsea buns sticky with glaze, fruit scones that promised to crumble perfectly under butter, and elaborate confections that seemed too beautiful to eat, but were clearly intended for precisely that purpose. They entered and emerged moments later with a paper bag of pastries that they carried like conspirators, finding a bench facing the sea where they could sit and consume their purchases while watching Brighton go about its morning business. The bench's wood was warm from the sun, worn smooth by countless previous sitters, and Watson found himself relaxing into it with the boneless contentment of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. The pastries were excellent, flaky, sweet, still warm from the oven, the kind of simple pleasure that required no analysis or justification. They ate in silence, watching the parade of humanity pass before them, and Watson felt something in his chest that he identified after a moment as happiness, uncomplicated and pure, the kind he had almost forgotten was possible. A street performer had established himself nearby, a juggler who kept 5 balls in the air with practiced ease while maintaining a running commentary that was equal parts joke and advertisement for tips. Children gathered to watch, their faces upturned with that absolute absorption that the young bring to spectacle, while parents smiled and reached for coins to drop in the performer's hat when he finished his routine. Further along the promenade, a Punch and Judy show was setting up, the striped booth being assembled with the efficiency of long practice. Watson had always found these shows slightly unsettling. The violence of the puppets' interactions, even in comedy, seemed too sharp, too close to something real beneath the slapstick surface. But children loved them, loved the predictability of Mr. Punch's misbehavior and the shrieking chaos that always ensued. The morning stretched and expanded, taking on that quality of timelessness that holidays sometimes achieved when the usual markers of temporal progression, appointments, obligations, the need to be somewhere specific at a designated hour, were temporarily suspended. Holmes seemed to be experiencing something similar, his usual restless energy replaced by a contemplative stillness that suggested he was actually succeeding in his self-imposed challenge of observing without analyzing, of simply letting Brighton exist without requiring it to make sense or reveal its secrets. They walked further, exploring the town's edges where the fashionable resort atmosphere gave way to the older fishing village that still existed beneath Brighton's cosmopolitan surface. Here the buildings were smaller, less ornate, their paint weathered by salt wind into softer versions of their original colours. Nets hung to dry in gardens, and the smell of fish was stronger, less disguised by the perfumes and pastries of the more touristy areas. An old man sat on a doorstep, mending a net with the automatic movements of someone who had performed this task thousands of times, whose hands knew the work so well that his mind was free to wander elsewhere. He nodded at Holmes and Watson as they passed, a greeting without words, that acknowledged their presence without requiring conversation. "That man's family has probably fished these waters for generations," Holmes observed, once they were out of earshot. "Before Brighton became fashionable, before the Prince Regent decided that sea air was therapeutic, before the railway made it accessible to London's masses. His life proceeds according to tides and seasons and the movements of fish, relatively untouched by the resort town that has grown up around his older, quieter world. Watson looked back at the fisherman, still working at his net with patient skill. Do you suppose he resents it? The transformation of his town into something that must seem quite foreign to what he knew in his youth. Perhaps, Holmes said. Or perhaps he simply accepts it as he accepts the tides, a force beyond his control that nonetheless creates the conditions in which he must live. Adaptation is the price of survival, whether for fishing villages or individual souls. They turned back toward the more populated areas, the morning now advancing toward midday, the sun climbing higher, and the crowds growing denser as more visitors emerged from their lodgings and hotels to claim their portion of Brighton's pleasures. The promenade had become a river of humanity, flowing in both directions, with occasional eddies, where people stopped to examine something or gather around a performer. And then, cutting through the general cheerful noise of the crowd, came that sound again, the one Watson had heard the previous evening from his window. A cry, wordless, and somehow bereft, carrying a quality that made him pause mid-step and turn toward its source. Holmes had heard it too, his head tilting in that characteristic way that meant his attention had been caught by something unexpected. They exchanged a glance, and Watson saw in his friend's eyes that same curiosity that no amount of holiday relaxation could entirely suppress. The sound came again, closer now, and Watson realized it was a child, a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing near the promenade railing with tears streaming down his face, his mouth open in distress. An elderly man stood beside him, a hand on the boy's shoulder, speaking words that Watson could not hear, but whose tone suggested comfort or reassurance. "Well?" Holmes said softly, straightening from his position of repose against the railing where they had been standing. "It appears Brighton has presented us with something after all. Come, Watson, let us see if there is anything to be done." And with that, their peaceful morning of aimless wandering took on a different quality, a direction, a purpose. The mystery of Brighton, small and human, and probably quite simple, had announced itself, and could not be ignored. Watson followed his friend toward the distressed child, the paper bag of pastries forgotten in his hand, his doctor's instincts and his detective companion's curiosity both fully engaged now. The sea continued its eternal work behind them, indifferent to human dramas large and small, but Watson barely heard it any more. The case, however minor, had begun. The boy's distress was palpable, even from a distance, a kind of misery that went beyond the usual childish upsets that dotted the promenade like brief summer storms, the dropped ice cream, the scraped knee, the sibling quarrel. This was something deeper, more profound, and it drew Holmes and Watson forward with the same magnetic pull that a puzzle always exerted on the former, and suffering always commanded from the latter. As they approached, Watson could see the child more clearly. He was perhaps 9 years old, though small for his age, with that wiry build that suggested regular meals were not always guaranteed. His clothes were clean, but well worn, mended in places with careful stitches that spoke of poverty, managed with dignity rather than destitution. His hair, a mousy brown, had been cut recently, but inexpertly, probably by a family member wielding kitchen scissors with more determination than skill. His face, streaked with tears and twisted in anguish, held a pale quality that suggested he spent more time indoors than the average child, though whether from illness or occupation Watson could not yet determine. The elderly man beside him, was equally modest in appearance. A grandfather, Watson guessed, with the weathered face of someone who'd worked outdoors for most of his life. His hand rested on the boy's shoulder with the gentle firmness of someone accustomed to providing comfort. But his expression held a helplessness that suggested this particular distress was beyond his capacity to remedy. Holmes and Watson came to a stop at a respectful distance, near enough to indicate their willingness to help, but not so close as to seem intrusive or threatening. Holmes had that particular expression on his face that Watson recognized. Professional interest combined with genuine human concern, the combination that made him, despite his professed indifference to sentiment, remarkably good with people who needed help. "Forgive the intrusion," Holmes began, his voice carrying that warm, reassuring quality he could summon when dealing with the distressed or vulnerable. But we could not help but notice the young man's obvious upset. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague Dr. Watson. If there is any assistance we might provide, we would be most willing to offer it." The elderly man looked up at them with the cautious gratitude of someone unused to help from strangers, but desperate enough to accept it. "Begging your pardon, sirs," he said, his accent carrying the soft burr of Sussex born and raised. "This is my grandson, Thomas. We've come to Brighton for the day. His mother, she's a seamstress up in London, saved for months so we could bring him down for the sea air. She thought it might." He paused, his hand tightening slightly on the boy's shoulder. "Well, she thought it might help." "Help with what, precisely?" Watson asked, stepping forward with his doctor's manner, gentle and professional at once. He crouched slightly so that he was more at the boy's eye level, a posture he had learned long ago, made frightened children feel less overwhelmed. The boy, Thomas, turned his tear-stained face toward Watson, and the doctor could see something in his eyes that he recognized immediately. Not quite desperation, but a kind of profound loss, the look of someone who had been robbed of something precious, and could not understand why the world would permit such a theft. "He's lost the sea's voice," the grandfather said, and then, seeing the confusion on both Holmes's and Watson's faces, amended quickly. "That is, he's saying he can't hear it any more. The sea. We came all this way, and he says he's lost it, lost the voice. He's been crying something terrible since we arrived at the promenade an hour ago." Holmes's eyebrow rose fractionally. That signal of interest peaked. "Cannot hear the sea, but surely the sound is quite evident." He gestured toward the channel, where waves continued their rhythmic percussion against the pebbled beach, a sound that was nearly constant beneath the human noise of the resort town. Thomas shook his head violently, more tears spilling down his cheeks. His mouth opened, and Watson saw him struggling to speak, fighting through emotion to form words. When they finally came, they were thick with distress, and that particular accent of London's working neighbourhoods, not quite Cockney, but in its general vicinity. "Can't hear it," the boy managed, his voice breaking on the words. "I could hear it earlier, when we first got here. Grandfather brought me down to the beach before breakfast, and I could hear it proper, the waves and the gulls and everything. It was the most beautiful thing I ever heard, better than Mum said it would be. But then we went for breakfast, and when we came back—" His voice dissolved into sobs again, his small frame shaking with the force of his grief. Watson felt something click into place in his medical mind, a possibility forming. "Thomas," he said gently, "forgive me for asking, but do you have difficulty hearing in general? Apart from the sea, I mean?" The boy nodded miserably. The grandfather spoke for him, relief evident in his voice at finally dealing with someone who seemed to understand. Born with it, he was. Hearing's weak in both ears, though the left is worse than the right. His mother saved up for one of those ear trumpets, you know, the brass kind. Cost her near a month's wages, but she said it was worth it, so Thomas could hear properly. Changed his whole life, it did. Suddenly he could hear his schoolmaster, hear other children, hear his mum singing. And she'd been promising him for months that if he was good and studied hard, she'd bring him to the sea so he could hear it through his trumpet. Understanding washed over Watson with the clarity of diagnosis confirmed. And the ear trumpet, where is it now? Thomas's face crumpled further, if such a thing were possible. Lost, he whispered. I had it this morning on the beach, holding it to my ear, listening to the waves. It was like music, but bigger, like the whole world was singing. And then we went for breakfast, and I must have... He couldn't continue, overwhelmed again by the magnitude of his loss. Holmes had been listening with that particular quality of attention he brought to problems, his eyes moving between the boy, the grandfather, and the surrounding area of the promenade, as if already beginning to map the possibilities. When did you last remember having it? He asked Thomas directly, his voice gentle but clear. The boy wiped at his face with his sleeve, trying to compose himself enough to answer properly. At breakfast, I think. No, wait, after breakfast. We came back to the promenade, and I wanted to hear the sea again, so I took it out and listened. There was a man playing a violin nearby, and I could hear both the violin and the waves together, and it was... He swallowed hard. It was the best thing ever. But then grandfather wanted to walk up to see the pier proper, and I must have put it down somewhere, or maybe it fell, I don't know. When I reached for it a bit ago, it was gone. Watson glanced at Holmes and saw the same thought reflected in his friend's eyes. This was no complex criminal conspiracy, no elaborate theft, but simply a child's carelessness, resulting in the loss of something irreplaceable. Irreplaceable not in monetary value, though the ear trumpet's cost represented significant sacrifice for a seamstress's family, but in the gift it provided, the ability to hear the world, and specifically the ability to hear the sea that the boy had travelled so far and waited so long to experience. Well, Holmes said, straightening to his full height and surveying the promenade with the systematic gaze of someone preparing to conduct a search. We must find it then. An ear trumpet is not a small object, and brass catches the light distinctively. If it was lost on the promenade or the beach, it will still be there unless someone has taken it, which seems unlikely. Most people would not recognize its value or purpose at a glance. The grandfather's face transformed with hope. Would you truly help us look, sir? We've been searching, but there's so many people, and Thomas is that upset he can't think straight about where he might have been. Of course we shall help, Watson said firmly, because there was never any question. Not really, once a child in distress had presented himself. Holmes, why don't you take Thomas and retrace his steps from breakfast onward? I'll accompany his grandfather and we can search the areas where they walked this morning before breakfast. We'll cover more ground that way. Holmes nodded, already crouching down to Thomas's level with that peculiar grace he had when dealing with the young or the vulnerable. Now then, Thomas, I need you to think very carefully and be very brave. Can you show me exactly where you were standing when you listened to the violin player? And then we shall trace every step you took afterward, and I promise you, we will either find your ear trumpet or determine precisely what became of it. But I need you to stop crying for just a little while and help me be a detective. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, scrubbing at his face with both hands, visibly trying to master his emotions through sheer force of will. There was something touching in the effort, in the way he straightened his small shoulders and took a shaky breath, determined to be worthy of this tall, serious man's attention and help. "Good lad," Holmes said warmly. "Now, show me where the violinist was." They split into two groups, Holmes and Thomas heading toward the bandstand area where the musicians typically congregated, while Watson and the grandfather, who introduced himself as Mr. Pemberton, retraced the morning's earlier path down to the beach itself. The beach was more crowded now than it had been at dawn, dotted with families and couples and solitary figures who had come to stand at the edge of England and look outward at the infinite water. Watson and Mr. Pemberton descended the wooden steps carefully, Watson noting how the old man's grip on the railing was tight, his knuckles white. Whether from age or anxiety he could not determine. "He's a good boy, Thomas is," Mr. Pemberton said as they reached the pebbles and began walking along the area where the waves had left their most recent mark, a darker band of wet stones that showed the tide's reach. Quiet, mostly. The hearing trouble made him that way, I think. When you can't always follow what people are saying, you learn to watch and listen more careful when you can. His mum, my daughter Sarah, she's done everything she could for him. Left her husband when Thomas was just a baby. The man drank, you see, and had a temper with it. She works herself half to death with the sewing, but she always makes sure Thomas has what he needs. Watson listened as they searched, his eyes scanning the pebbles for any glint of brass, any object that might be the lost ear trumpet. The stones were beautiful, up close, grey and cream and amber and rose, smoothed by centuries of wave action into pleasing ovals and rounds. Each one was slightly different, and Watson found himself understanding the appeal of collecting them, of searching for the perfect stone to carry home as a memory of the sea. The ear trumpet, Watson ventured as they walked, it made a significant difference to his quality of life. "Night and day," Mr. Pemberton confirmed, his own eyes fixed on the ground as they moved slowly along the beach. Before he got it, he was falling behind at school, couldn't follow the lessons proper. Other children thought he was slow or stupid, which he isn't, sharp as anything, Thomas is, when he can hear what's being said. The trumpet changed everything. Suddenly, he could learn, could talk to other children, could hear his mum when she called him. And she'd been promising him this trip for so long, telling him about the sea, about how beautiful it sounded. He was that excited, hardly slept the night before we came down on the early train. They searched methodically, covering the area where Mr. Pemberton remembered walking with Thomas that morning. But the beach yielded nothing more interesting than pretty stones and bits of seaweed, the occasional shell that the channel sometimes surrendered, despite its pebbled rather than sandy nature. After 20 minutes of careful searching, Watson had to acknowledge that if the ear trumpet had been dropped here, it had likely been covered by the tide's movement, or possibly taken by another beachgoer who thought it an interesting piece of brass to add to their collection. They climbed back up to the promenade, where the morning had fully transformed into midday, the sun now directly overhead, and the crowds at their thickest. The musicians had multiplied, each claiming their territory along the walking route, their sounds overlapping in a way that created an almost carnival atmosphere. The violinist they had heard earlier was still at his position near the bandstand, his bow moving across the strings with practiced ease, his violin case open at his feet with a scattering of coins that suggested the morning had been moderately profitable. Holmes and Thomas were nearby, the great detective, crouched low and examining the ground around a bench with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for crime scenes. Thomas stood beside him, no longer crying, but still pale, his hands clasped together in front of him with that particular tension of someone trying very hard to maintain composure. Watson and Mr. Pemberton approached just as Holmes sat back on his heels, his expression thoughtful. "Well," he said, looking up at Thomas, "I believe I have traced your movements quite precisely. You stood here, by this bench, with the ear trumpet to your ear, listening to our violinist friend. Then your grandfather called to you. He was standing over there, near the railing, looking at something on the beach below. You turned to answer him, and in that moment I believe you set the ear trumpet down on this bench, just for a moment, intending to pick it up again immediately." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes widening as memory clearly came back to him. Yes, that's right. I put it down just for a second, because grandfather was pointing at something, and I wanted to see what he was showing me." "And then?" Holmes prompted gently. "Then we walked over to the railing together, looked at, I can't even remember what it was now, some bird or something. And then grandfather said we should walk up to see the pier, and we just started walking. I didn't remember. I forgot I'd put it down." Holmes stood, brushing off his hands. A perfectly understandable mistake. The world is full of wonders when one is 9 years old and experiencing the sea for the first time. The question now is, what became of the ear trumpet after you left it? He turned his attention to the bench itself, examining it with that systematic thoroughness that Watson had seen applied to everything from bloodstains to cigar ash. It was a typical seaside bench, green-painted wood, iron frame, a small brass plaque on the backrest, dedicating it to the memory of someone long dead, who had presumably loved this view. The bench faced the sea, positioned to provide the optimal viewing angle of the channel's expanse. "No trumpet," Holmes murmured, "which means either someone took it, which seems unlikely, given that most people would not recognize its function or value, or—" He dropped to his knees, peering under the bench with the focus of someone who had found something interesting. Watson watched as his friend reached beneath the bench, his long arm extending into the shadows below the seat. There was a moment of silence, and then Holmes made a small sound of satisfaction, withdrawing his arm slowly and carefully. When his hand emerged into the sunlight, it held a brass ear trumpet, slightly tarnished, but otherwise undamaged. Thomas's gasp was audible even over the ambient noise of the promenade. His face transformed in an instant, from misery to joy, so pure and complete that Watson felt his own throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The boy reached for the trumpet, with shaking hands, taking it from Holmes as if it were made of the most delicate glass. "You found it," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with wonder and relief. "You actually found it." "It had rolled under the bench," Holmes explained, standing and brushing off his knees. Probably kicked there accidentally by someone walking past. The space beneath is shadowed enough that it would be easy to miss, unless one knew to look specifically in that location. But Thomas was no longer listening. He had raised the ear trumpet to his ear, turning toward the sea, and his expression as the sound reached him was something Watson knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Pure joy, uncomplicated by adult cynicism or reservation, the joy of having something precious lost and then found again, restored exactly when one had given up hope of restoration. "I can hear it," Thomas said, his voice breaking with happiness this time, rather than grief. "I can hear it again. The waves, the gulls, everything. It's still there. The sea's still singing." Mr. Pemberton's eyes were wet as he gripped Holmes's hand in both of his, shaking it with the fervent gratitude of someone who had witnessed something close to a miracle. "Thank you, sir. Thank you both. You don't know what this means, what it would have meant to his mother if we'd had to go back to London and tell her we'd lost it. The money, yes, but more than that, the disappointment for the boy. This was to be his special day." Holmes looked almost uncomfortable with the gratitude, as he always did when confronted with raw emotion. "It was a simple matter of deduction and careful searching," he demurred. "Any reasonably observant person could have done the same." But Watson knew better, and he suspected Mr. Pemberton did too. Most people would have offered sympathy, perhaps suggested reporting the loss to the local constabulary, but would not have taken the time to conduct an actual investigation, to treat a child's lost hearing aid with the same seriousness that Holmes brought to matters of theft or murder. It was this quality, this insistence on applying his considerable gifts to any problem that presented itself, regardless of its seeming importance, that made Holmes more than just a brilliant mind, that made him, despite his protests to the contrary, fundamentally decent. Thomas had moved to the railing now, the ear trumpet pressed to his ear, his face turned toward the channel with an expression of rapture. He was listening to the sea as if it were the most beautiful music ever composed, which, Watson supposed, for a child who had spent most of his life in muffled silence, it probably was. The boy stood there for several minutes while the adults watched, giving him time to drink in the sound, to store it in his memory, against the time when he would return to London streets and his mother's small flat. Finally, he turned back to them, his face still glowing with happiness. "Thank you," he said, looking directly at Holmes. "Thank you for helping me hear it again." "You are most welcome, young man," Holmes replied, and there was something gentle in his voice that Watson rarely heard. "Take care of that trumpet, and take care of yourself. The world has enough silence in it, without adding to it unnecessarily." They parted ways then, Mr. Pemberton and Thomas heading off to continue their day of seaside exploration, the boy's hand now carefully gripping the ear trumpet, as if he would never let it out of his possession again. Holmes and Watson watched them go, the old man and the child walking together along the promenade, Thomas stopping every few steps to raise the trumpet to his ear and listen to whatever sounds caught his attention. "Well," Watson said after a moment, "so much for a holiday free of mysteries." Holmes smiled, that genuine expression that made him look years younger. A small mystery, surely, and one that resolved peacefully. I believe that qualifies as precisely the kind of gentle adventure one hopes for at the seaside. No violence, no criminals, no dark secrets, merely a lost object and a child's joy restored. "His face when you handed him the trumpet," Watson said softly. I shall remember that for a long time." "As shall I," Holmes agreed. They stood together in companionable silence for a moment, and then Holmes clapped Watson on the shoulder. "Come, old friend, the day is young yet, and I believe we have earned ourselves some lunch. I noticed a promising establishment near the pier that advertises fish and chips, that most democratic of English meals. Let us see if Brighton's offering can match the culinary standards we've come to expect from Mrs. Hudson's considerably more limited repertoire." And with that, they turned away from the railing and the sea, walking together into the midday brightness of Brighton at its most lively, the sound of Thomas's rediscovered sea voice ringing in their ears like a small, perfect chord of resolution. The establishment Holmes had spotted proved to be a modest place called the Neptune's Catch, tucked into a narrow building between a shop selling postcards and another offering parasols in every imaginable shade. Its exterior was painted a cheerful blue that had faded somewhat under the assault of salt air and sun, and a hand-lettered sign in the window proclaimed, with more confidence than grammar, "Best fish and chips in all Brighton, guaranteed fresh daily or your money back." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of frying fish and vinegar, that particular combination that somehow managed to be both sharp and comforting at once. The space was small and crowded, with perhaps 6 tables covered in checkered cloths that had seen better days, and a counter behind which a large woman presided over bubbling vats of oil with the authority of a ship's captain navigating treacherous waters. Her face was red from the heat, her sleeves rolled up to reveal arms that suggested she was accustomed to hard work, and her expression held that particular mixture of efficiency and good humour that characterized successful proprietors of working-class establishments. "Sit anywhere you like, loves," she called out when she saw them enter, barely glancing up from the fish she was lowering carefully into the hot oil. "Menu's on the wall, but I'll tell you now, if you want anything fancy, you're in the wrong place. We do fish, we do chips, we do mushy peas if you're feeling adventurous. That's it. But we do it better than anyone else on this stretch of coast, and I'll fight anyone who says different." Holmes and Watson exchanged amused glances and found a table near the window, where they could watch the promenade traffic while waiting for their meal. The other patrons were a mixed collection, a pair of working men still in their clothes from some morning labour, a family of 4 with children who swung their legs impatiently under the table, an elderly couple who ate in the comfortable silence of long marriage, and a young woman who might have been a shop girl on her lunch break, reading a penny dreadful novel while mechanically consuming her chips. The proprietress arrived at their table with remarkable speed, given her size, wiping her hands on her apron and pulling a stub of pencil from behind her ear. "2 portions of fish and chips?" she asked, not really posing it as a question so much as stating the inevitable. "Vinegar? Salt? Mushy peas?" "Everything," Holmes confirmed. "And tea, if you have it." "Course we have tea. What kind of English establishment wouldn't have tea?" She shook her head at the absurdity of the question and bustled away, already calling their order toward the kitchen, in a voice that carried over the general noise without seeming to shout. Watson settled into his chair, feeling the pleasant fatigue that came from a morning of walking and the satisfaction of a good deed accomplished. The case of the lost ear trumpet, if one could call it a case at all, had been resolved within an hour, leaving the rest of the day open for the kind of aimless exploration that was the truest luxury of a holiday. No urgency, no pressing matters, nothing required except the willingness to experience whatever Brighton chose to present. That boy's joy, Watson said, returning to the image that had lodged itself in his mind. It reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten, that the world still contains simple happinesses, uncomplicated by adult concerns or cynicism. The ability to hear the sea through a brass trumpet, and to have that ability restored after believing it lost. That was his entire universe in that moment. Everything else fell away. Holmes nodded, his long fingers drumming absently on the checkered tablecloth. Children possess a remarkable capacity for absolute emotion. They experience joy and sorrow with a purity that adults spend their lives trying to recapture, or more often, trying to avoid. We learn to moderate our feelings, to protect ourselves through emotional restraint. But in doing so, we sacrifice something of that intensity. Thomas's despair when he thought the trumpet was lost forever was as complete as his joy when it was found. No qualification, no hedging, no adult thoughts about replacement costs or practical solutions. Simply, I have lost something precious, and now I have found it again. Their tea arrived, brought by a young girl who couldn't have been more than 14, her arms bare and already developing the musculature that came from carrying heavy trays. She set the pot down with careful attention, along with 2 thick mugs that looked like they could withstand being dropped from a considerable height, and departed without a word, though she offered them a shy smile when Watson thanked her. Watson poured for both of them, the tea dark and strong, the kind that demanded milk and sugar to be truly drinkable. It was not elegant tea, not the sort served in fine china in drawing rooms, where conversation was an art form, and silence was filled with the delicate clink of silver spoons. This was working tea, functional and restorative, designed to provide energy for the labour of daily life, rather than to accompany philosophical discussion. And yet, Watson thought as he took his first sip, it was perfect for this moment, in this place, after this morning. Brighton was revealing itself to be a town of honest pleasures, of experiences unadorned by pretension or complexity. The sea was the sea, the fish was the fish, the tea was the tea. There was something deeply restful in that straightforwardness. I find myself wondering about his mother, Holmes said, adding sugar to his tea with more generosity than was probably wise. The seamstress who saved a month's wages for an ear trumpet, who promised her son the sea as a reward for good behaviour and diligent study. Single mother, you said the grandfather mentioned, left her husband due to his drinking and temper? That's what I understood, yes. So she works herself, in Mr. Pemberton's words, half to death to provide for her son, makes sacrifices to give him tools that will improve his life, plans treats that require months of saving, all while navigating the considerable challenges of being a woman alone in London's economy. Holmes paused, sipping his tea thoughtfully. One meets many types in my line of work, Watson. Criminals with elaborate justifications for their crimes, victims whose suffering seems almost theatrical in its excess, witnesses who lie or misremember or colour their testimony with their own prejudices. But the quiet heroism of people like Thomas's mother, working without recognition, sacrificing without complaint, showing love through practical action rather than sentiment, that is something I encounter less frequently, but find infinitely more impressive. Watson felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the tea. These glimpses into Holmes's fundamental decency, his ability to recognize and appreciate goodness when he encountered it, were part of what made their friendship so valuable. The world saw Sherlock Holmes as cold, analytical, interested only in puzzles and intellectual challenges. But Watson knew better. He knew the man who would spend an hour searching for a child's lost hearing aid, who would speak with genuine respect about a seamstress's sacrifices, who could be moved by simple human goodness, even while maintaining his facade of detachment. Their fish and chips arrived then, delivered by the proprietress herself with a flourish that suggested pride in her work. The portions were generous to the point of absurdity. 2 large pieces of battered fish, golden and glistening with oil, accompanied by a mountain of chips that seemed to defy the physical limitations of the plate. Mushy peas occupied a small bowl on the side, their grey-green colour unappetizing, but their smell promising more than their appearance suggested. "There you are, loves," the woman said with satisfaction. "Best in Brighton, like I told you. You let me know if that's not the finest fish you've ever eaten, and I'll personally refund your money and close up shop in shame." Holmes assured her that such drastic measures would likely be unnecessary, and she departed with a laugh that was nearly as generous as her portions. The first bite confirmed the accuracy of her boasting. The fish was indeed fresh, the flesh white and flaky, the batter crisp on the outside while remaining tender where it met the fish. The chips were perfectly cooked, soft interior, crispy exterior, the kind of simple preparation that was far more difficult to execute well than it appeared. Watson applied salt and vinegar with liberal abandon, watching the seasoning soak into the chips, transforming them from merely good to genuinely excellent. They ate in appreciative silence for several minutes, the kind of focused attention that good food deserved and demanded. Around them, the restaurant continued its lunchtime business. The proprietress calling orders, the young serving girl weaving between tables with practiced agility. The other diners engaged in their own meals and conversations. It was a scene of absolute ordinariness, and precisely because of that ordinariness, it felt almost sacred, a moment of pure present-tense experience, unencumbered by past or future, by obligation or concern. "You know," Watson said after they had made significant progress through their portions, "when you suggested this trip, I confess I had doubts. I worried that you would be bored within hours, that the lack of intellectual stimulation would drive you to distraction, that you might spend the entire time desperately seeking problems to solve, just to keep your mind occupied." Holmes raised an eyebrow, amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "And instead, you seem genuinely relaxed, present, if that makes sense. Not constantly analyzing or deducing or constructing theories about everyone we encounter. Simply being here." "Perhaps," Holmes said slowly, selecting another chip and examining it as if it might contain hidden wisdom, "perhaps that is the true value of these interludes. Not the absence of problems to solve, but the presence of problems so small and straightforward that they require no great effort to address. Finding a child's ear trumpet takes observation and method, yes, but it lacks the weight of criminal conspiracy or moral complexity. It is a pure problem. Something lost must be found. Someone distressed must be comforted. The solution brings uncomplicated joy, with no lingering questions about justice or human nature, or the darkness that lurks in supposedly civilized society." He paused, sipping his tea, his gaze drifting toward the window and the sun-bright promenade beyond. In London, every case, no matter how it begins, seems to open onto deeper caverns of human vice or desperation. A stolen necklace reveals a gambling addiction that has destroyed a family. A missing person turns out to be fleeing blackmail or abuse. A simple fraud connects to larger networks of crime. One pulls at a single thread and finds it attached to a tapestry of misery. It is necessary work, and I find it intellectually satisfying, but it accumulates a certain psychic weight. Watson nodded, understanding completely. He had felt that weight himself, had written about cases, and then found himself unable to sleep, his mind returning again and again to the human suffering they had encountered, the lives damaged or destroyed, the questions that had no satisfying answers. So Brighton, Watson said softly, represents not an escape from problems, but an encounter with problems of a different order. Problems that can be solved without revealing the worst of human nature. Mysteries that end in joy rather than justice. Precisely. Holmes returned his attention to his meal, spearing a piece of fish with his fork. Though I confess I did not articulate this to myself before we arrived, I simply felt the need to leave London, to breathe different air, to see different sights. The clarity about why such interludes are valuable comes only in the experiencing of them. They finished their meal in companionable quiet, the food doing its work of providing both sustenance and satisfaction. The mushy peas, despite their unpromising appearance, turned out to be excellent, properly seasoned, with a texture that complemented rather than competed with the fish and chips. Watson found himself eating every last bite, his appetite sharpened by the morning sea air and walking, his pleasure in the meal enhanced by the simple honesty of its preparation and presentation. When they finally pushed back from the table, thoroughly satisfied, the proprietress appeared as if summoned by telepathy. "Well?" she demanded, hands on her ample hips. "Was I lying about the quality, or do I keep my shop?" "Your establishment is safe," Holmes assured her with genuine warmth. "That was, without exaggeration, the finest fish and chips I have consumed in recent memory. You have every right to your confident advertising." She beamed at them, clearly pleased, despite having probably heard similar compliments dozens of times that day. "You come back before you leave Brighton, you hear? And tell your friends. I don't need fancy reviews or newspaper write-ups. I just need good people eating good food and spreading the word. That's how honest business works." Holmes paid the modest bill and left a tip that made the young serving girl's eyes widen with gratitude, and they emerged back onto the promenade into the full warmth of early afternoon. The sun was high now, the light taking on that quality it had in late spring, bright but not harsh, warm but not oppressive, the kind of sunshine that made movement pleasant rather than effortful. The promenade had reached its peak of daily activity, crowded with visitors who had completed their morning explorations and were now engaged in the serious business of seaside leisure. The beach was dotted with families, children shrieking with joy as waves approached their careful sandcastles or pebble castles given Brighton's stony shore. Vendors had multiplied, their carts offering everything from lemonade to souvenir shells to small toys that would break before the journey home, but seemed essential in the moment. The musicians had changed shifts, morning performers replaced by afternoon entertainments. A woman with a mandolin sang ballads in a voice that carried sweetly over the general noise, her repertoire spanning centuries from old folk songs to more recent music hall favourites. Near the pier entrance, a magician had gathered a crowd, his patter as impressive as his sleight of hand, his top hat already half filled with coins from appreciative spectators. "Shall we walk to the pier?" Watson suggested. "We've passed it several times, but haven't yet ventured onto it properly." Holmes agreed, and they joined the flow of humanity moving toward that iconic structure. Brighton's pier extending into the channel like a finger, pointing toward France, toward the continent, toward all the foreign mysteries that lay beyond England's shores. The pier had been built relatively recently in 1823, part of Brighton's transformation from fishing village to fashionable resort, and it embodied that transformation perfectly, functional engineering dressed up in decorative confidence, practicality and pleasure, combined in equal measure. The entrance required a penny each for admission, collected by a bored-looking attendant who had probably taken thousands of pennies that day alone and would take thousands more before his shift ended. They paid and passed through onto the pier proper, and immediately the sensation changed. Here they were no longer on land, but not quite at sea either, suspended in that liminal space where the water moved beneath them, and the shore remained visible behind them, and the horizon beckoned ahead. The pier's wooden planks were worn smooth by countless feet, and Watson could feel them shifting slightly with the movement of the waves below, a subtle reminder that this structure, however solid it seemed, was at the mercy of forces far greater than human engineering. The railings on either side were painted white, though salt and weather had chipped the paint in places, revealing the grey metal beneath. At regular intervals, gaps in the planking allowed views down to the water below, where waves moved in their eternal patterns, and the occasional fish could be glimpsed darting through the shadows. The pier was lined with attractions that spoke to Victorian ideas of entertainment and edification. A camera obscura promised to show visitors Brighton from a new perspective, through the magic of mirrors and lenses. A penny arcade offered mechanical games of skill and chance. Knock down the milk bottles, test your strength, predict your fortune from a mechanical fortune teller whose painted face smiled with eerie perpetuity. A small aquarium displayed local marine life in tanks that allowed viewers to see creatures of the deep without getting wet, each fish swimming endlessly in its confined space, probably dreaming of the open ocean that lay just meters away. And everywhere, people, couples walking arm in arm, children running despite signs requesting they walk, families gathering at the railings to point at boats or seabirds, or simply the mesmerizing movement of water. The pier was democracy in action, all classes mixing in the pursuit of pleasure, united by the universal human desire to stand above the sea and feel simultaneously powerful and humbled by its vastness. Holmes and Watson walked slowly, pausing occasionally to observe a particular attraction, or simply to lean on the railing and watch the water move beneath them. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and insistent, their eyes always watching for dropped food or unwary fingers holding something edible. They were beautiful birds when examined closely, the graceful curve of wing, the precise control of flight, the way the light caught their white feathers. But they were also opportunistic scavengers with the manners of pickpockets, and Watson had already seen several successful thefts of ice cream and pastries from distracted visitors. The seabirds here have learned to exploit human carelessness, Holmes observed, watching a particularly bold gull swoop down and snatch a biscuit from a child's hand before the boy even registered the attack. They have adapted their natural behaviors to take advantage of this artificial environment we have created. Natural selection in real time. The boldest and cleverest birds get the most food, and thus are most likely to survive and pass on their genes. Give it a few more generations, and Brighton's gulls will probably have evolved specific strategies for different types of food or different types of tourists. Watson chuckled. You cannot help yourself, can you? Even watching seagulls, you are analyzing and theorizing. It is not analysis, Holmes protested mildly. It is simply observation leading naturally to understanding. I am not seeking to deduce the gulls' life histories or solve mysteries about their behavior. I am merely noting what is evident to anyone who watches for more than a moment. They had reached the end of the pier now, where it terminated in a broader platform that offered unobstructed views in all directions. Behind them lay Brighton, its buildings white and cream against the green of the downs rising beyond the town. Before them stretched the channel, its surface moving in patterns of wave and current, light and shadow, its far shore invisible, despite the clarity of the day. To either side, the coast curved away in both directions, the white cliffs of Sussex rising like ancient sentinels, marking the edge of England with chalk-white certainty. It was beautiful, Watson thought, simply, undeniably beautiful. Not in the way of great art or architecture, not in the way of careful human creation, but in the way of natural forces doing what they had always done, would always do, indifferent to human observation or appreciation. The sea would be here long after Brighton's pier had collapsed into it, long after the buildings on shore had crumbled, long after every person currently standing on this platform had died and been forgotten. There was something both melancholy and oddly comforting in that thought. They stood there in silence for several minutes, two men at the end of a pier, watching the water and thinking their own thoughts. Around them, other visitors did the same, some in conversation, others in contemplative quiet, all of them drawn by something ancient and wordless. The call of the edge, the desire to stand at the meeting place of land and sea and feel themselves part of something larger than their individual concerns. Finally, Holmes stirred, turning away from the railing with visible effort, as if breaking free from the water's hypnotic pull. "Come," he said quietly. "The afternoon is still young, and Brighton has more to show us. We should not spend all our time in one place, however pleasant that place might be." Watson nodded, and followed his friend back along the pier toward shore, though he found himself looking back several times, reluctant to leave that liminal space, that place suspended between earth and water, between the solid certainty of land and the fluid infinity of the sea. The afternoon sun had shifted position by the time they left the pier, transforming Brighton's light into something softer, more golden, the kind of illumination that made everything look slightly dreamlike, as if the town had been dipped in honey. The crowds on the promenade had thinned somewhat as families retreated to their lodgings, for rest or tea, that peculiarly English ritual that divided the day into manageable segments, providing structure to what might otherwise become an overwhelming expanse of leisure time. Holmes and Watson walked without particular direction, content to let their feet choose the path, following curiosity rather than plan. They wandered away from the seafront, into the streets that lay behind Brighton's glamorous facade, where the town revealed its more practical nature. The shops that served residents rather than tourists. The businesses that kept the resort functioning even when visitors departed. The ordinary life that continued beneath and beyond the holiday atmosphere. Here, the buildings were less pristinely painted, their facades showing the honest wear of daily use rather than the carefully maintained appearance demanded by the promenade. A laundry advertised its services in faded letters on a wooden sign that creaked in the sea breeze. A cobbler's shop displayed boots and shoes in its window, the leather cracked in places, waiting for skilled hands to restore them to usefulness. A greengrocer arranged vegetables with the careful attention of someone who knew that presentation mattered even for cabbages and potatoes, that dignity could be found in any honest work well done. The people here moved differently too, with purpose, rather than aimless pleasure, going about the business of their lives rather than the business of leisure. A woman with a basket over her arm examined apples with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly how far her money needed to stretch. Two men in working clothes discuss something in low tones, their body language suggesting either complaint or conspiracy, though probably the former. The English working class had elevated complaint to an art form, a way of acknowledging life's difficulties while simultaneously asserting one's ability to endure them. "This is the real Brighton," Watson observed quietly. Not the postcard version we see on the promenade, but the actual town where people live and work and raise families. The resort is built on top of this, but this is what gives it foundation. Holmes nodded, his eyes moving over the scene with that particular quality of attention he brought to anything that interested him. Every fashionable location has this duality. The face it presents to visitors, and the face it shows to those who actually inhabit it. London is the same, though on a vastly larger scale. Mayfair and the East End, both part of the same city, but occupying such different realities that they might as well be different countries. Brighton's version is more compressed, more visible, but the principle is identical. They passed a small school, its yard empty now, but showing evidence of recent occupation. A forgotten ball in one corner. Chalk drawings on the pavement that rain would eventually erase. The general disarray that children created simply by existing in a space. Through one window, Watson could see a teacher still at her desk, bent over papers, with the weary concentration of someone grading assignments after the students had departed. Her face, even glimpsed briefly, held that particular expression of patience, tested but not broken, dedication that persisted despite exhaustion. Thomas's teacher, perhaps, Holmes murmured, following Watson's gaze, or someone very like her. Educating children who struggle to hear, to concentrate, to see the relevance of lessons to their eventual lives. Another form of quiet heroism, teaching in a working-class school, trying to give children tools that might help them rise above their circumstances, or, at least, manage them more effectively. They walked on, turning down a narrow street that curved upward, following the contours of the land that sloped away from the sea. The climb was gentle but steady, and Watson felt it in his legs, a pleasant burn that reminded him of his body's existence after the morning's more level walking. At the top of the rise, the street opened onto a small square dominated by a church, its stone dark with age and weather, its architecture speaking to centuries rather than decades. The churchyard surrounded the building, enclosed by a low stone wall, and Holmes and Watson entered through an iron gate that protested faintly on its hinges. Inside, the gravestones stood in varying states of preservation, some upright and readable, others tilted or crumbling, their inscriptions worn away by time and rain, until the names and dates they commemorated had become illegible, the dead rendered anonymous by the same forces that had taken their lives. Watson had always found something peaceful about old churchyards, something honest in their acknowledgement of mortality. Here lay the people who had lived in Brighton and its predecessor Brighthelmstone over the centuries. Fishermen and their wives, merchants and tradesmen, children who had died before reaching adulthood, mothers who had died in childbirth, the elderly who had simply worn out after long lives of labour. Each stone represented a life, a collection of experiences and relationships and small moments that had seemed vitally important to the person living them, and now existed only as dates carved in stone, slowly being erased by weather and time. Holmes moved among the graves with something approaching reverence, reading inscriptions when they were still legible, pausing occasionally before stones that held some detail of particular interest. Watson followed more slowly, letting his mind drift in that pleasant way that old graves permitted, thinking about mortality without the sharp edge of fear that usually accompanied such thoughts. Death was inevitable, these stones proclaimed, but not terrible. Life preceded it, and that life had meaning to those who lived it, even if that meaning was eventually forgotten. "Here's an interesting one," Holmes called softly, standing before a grave near the church's eastern wall. Watson joined him and read the inscription that had caught his friend's attention. "Here lies Margaret Ashford, born 1807, died 1891, devoted wife, loving mother, faithful friend. She brought light wherever she walked and left darkness when she departed. Died last year," Watson noted. "Recent enough that people living in Brighton now would remember her. I wonder who she was, what she did to earn such an epitaph." "Probably nothing remarkable by society's standards," Holmes said thoughtfully. "No great achievements recorded, no titles or honours mentioned. Simply a woman who was devoted, loving, faithful, and somehow managed to bring light to those around her, which is, when one considers it carefully, far more difficult and valuable than most of the accomplishments society chooses to celebrate. Anyone with sufficient ambition and ruthlessness can achieve fame or fortune. To bring light wherever one walks requires genuine goodness, sustained over a lifetime, expressed in small daily actions rather than grand gestures." They stood before Margaret Ashford's grave for another moment, two living men paying respects to a woman they had never known, acknowledging the quiet heroism her epitaph suggested. Then they moved on, deeper into the churchyard, where older graves gave way to truly ancient ones, stones so weathered that their inscriptions had become mere shadows, suggestions of letters that might once have spelled names, but now spelled only time's inevitable victory. Near the far wall, partially hidden by an overgrown yew tree, they found a bench. Old wood gone grey with age, iron frame rusted, but still sturdy. They sat without discussion, both feeling the pleasant fatigue that came from walking and climbing, both content to rest in this quiet place, while Brighton went about its afternoon business beyond the churchyard's stone walls. The silence here was different from the silence of their Baker Street sitting room. There, quiet always felt temporary, a pause between cases or conversations, charged with the potential for interruption. Here, silence felt fundamental, essential, the natural state of a place dedicated to those who had moved beyond the need for words or action. The only sounds were the wind moving through the yews branches, the distant cry of seagulls even here, inland, and the soft rustle of leaves from trees that had been growing long before any of the people buried here had been born. Watson let his eyes close, feeling the sun on his face, even through the yews-dappled shade, feeling his breathing slow and deepen, feeling his mind begin to drift, in that space between waking and sleeping that was often the most peaceful state of all. He was aware of Holmes beside him, aware of the bench beneath him, aware of Brighton spreading out below their elevated position, but distantly, as if all of it existed on the other side of a gauze curtain, present but not pressing, there but not demanding attention. Time passed. How much, Watson could not have said with certainty. Minutes, certainly. Perhaps longer. In the churchyard's timeless quiet, conventional measurements seemed almost irrelevant. The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifted their positions, the world turned on its axis, as it always had, and always would, indifferent to human awareness or concern. Watson might have actually dozed. He was never quite certain afterward. But he was pulled back to full consciousness by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path that wound through the churchyard. He opened his eyes to see an elderly clergyman approaching, his black clothing marking his profession, his gait slow but steady. Despite the walking stick, he carried more for reassurance than necessity. "Good afternoon," the clergyman said when he reached speaking distance, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, but not demanding attention. "Forgive me if I'm intruding on private meditation, but I like to check on visitors to our churchyard, make certain they're finding what they seek, whatever that might be." "Not intruding at all," Holmes assured him, straightening from his relaxed posture. "We're visitors to Brighton, taking advantage of a beautiful afternoon to explore beyond the more obvious tourist attractions. Your churchyard provides a peaceful respite from the promenade's crowds." The clergyman smiled, his face creasing into lines that suggested he smiled often. "That's precisely what it's meant to provide, among other things. I'm Reverend Thomas Pemberton. Yes, same surname as the grandfather you met this morning, though no relation that I know of. Small world, Brighton, despite the tourists. Word travels quickly about gentlemen from London who help lost boys find their hearing." Holmes and Watson exchanged surprised glances. "News does travel quickly indeed," Watson said. "We had no idea our small assistance would generate conversation." "Oh, everything generates conversation in a town this size," Reverend Pemberton assured them, settling himself on the bench beside them with the careful attention of someone whose joints required negotiation. The boy's grandfather mentioned it to a friend, who mentioned it to his wife, who happened to mention it when she came in for choir practice this afternoon. By tomorrow, the story will have transformed into something far more dramatic. You'll probably have rescued the boy from drowning or solved some ancient mystery. That's how these things work. But the truth is quite lovely enough on its own. Strangers helping a child in distress, a lost object found, a day of disappointment transformed into joy. Those are the stories that restore one's faith in human nature, which, in my profession, is always in need of restoration. He paused, his gaze moving over the churchyard with the familiarity of long association. "I've been vicar here for 30 years, he continued quietly. "Baptized 3 generations of Brighton families, married couples who are now grandparents, buried people I watched grow from children to elderly. This churchyard holds layers of community, relationships that extended across lifetimes, families that have been here since before Brighton became fashionable. Sometimes I think the tourists see only the surface, the promenade, the pier, the entertainment, and miss the actual town that exists beneath and within all that performance." "We were just discussing something similar," Watson said. "The difference between Brighton as resort and Brighton as actual community, as a place where people live complete lives rather than simply visit for pleasure." "Exactly so." The Reverend nodded approvingly. "Though I wouldn't want to suggest that the resort aspect is somehow false or invalid. Brighton embraced its transformation quite deliberately, saw an opportunity to become something beyond a fishing village, and seized it with both hands. There's courage in that, and creativity. The challenge is maintaining both identities, providing pleasure for visitors while preserving community for residents. We manage it mostly, though the balance shifts and requires constant attention." Holmes had been listening with that quality of focus he brought to any conversation that interested him. "The boy this morning, Thomas, he lives in London with his mother, but visits his grandfather here. That suggests family ties that persist despite the economic necessity of seeking work elsewhere." "Common pattern," the Reverend confirmed. "Brighton's working families have always been mobile, following work where it can be found. Fishing, when that was the main industry, required boats and capital that not everyone possessed. So younger sons, or families fallen on hard times, they went elsewhere. London, often, where there's always work for those willing to take it, even if the work is hard and the pay poor. But they maintain connections, come back when they can, keep their children connected to grandparents and aunts and uncles. It's how communities survive displacement and economic change, through determination to remain connected despite the forces pulling them apart." He fell silent for a moment, and the 3 men sat together on the bench, looking out over the churchyard with its population of the dead and its living testimony to continuity and memory. Watson found himself thinking about Thomas and his mother Sarah, about the choices she had made and continued to make, leaving a dangerous husband, raising a child alone, working herself half to death, but still finding ways to give that child joy and tools for a better life. About the grandfather who had probably helped raise his own children in this very town, and now welcomed his grandson for precious visits that kept family bonds strong despite distance and difficulty. "The mother saved for months to buy her son an ear trumpet," Watson said, more to himself than to the others, sacrificed her own needs and wants so he could hear properly, could succeed at school, could experience the sea she'd promised him. And then planned this trip, saved again, arranged everything so he could have one perfect day at the seaside. That kind of love, that kind of dedication, it deserves recognition, celebration. But it happens quietly, in working-class families all over England, and goes mostly unnoticed, except by those directly involved. "God notices," Reverend Pemberton said simply, "whether or not anyone else does. That's the faith I try to maintain, even in the face of considerable evidence that the universe is indifferent to human suffering. That love matters, that sacrifice is seen and honoured somewhere, somehow, even if not in ways we immediately recognise. It's what keeps me coming to this church, conducting services, counselling parishioners, burying the dead and baptising the living. The belief that all of it means something, even when meaning is not obvious or immediate. Holmes, who rarely engaged with religious topics and whose own beliefs Watson had never been entirely able to discern, seemed moved by the old vicar's quiet conviction. Meaning is where we find it, he said carefully, or perhaps where we create it. The universe may indeed be indifferent, but we are not indifferent to the universe or to each other. We notice suffering and try to alleviate it. We witness love and are moved by it. We see beauty and create more beauty in response. That may not require divine attention or cosmic significance. It may be enough that we do these things simply because we are human and capable of doing them. Well said, the Reverend replied, seeming not at all offended by Holmes's essentially secular philosophy. Whether the foundation is faith or simple human decency, the actions are what matter. You helped a child this morning because you could, because his distress moved you, because finding a lost object and restoring joy seemed like the right thing to do. The motivation matters less than the action itself. They sat in companionable silence for another few minutes, 3 men of different backgrounds and beliefs finding common ground in a churchyard on a Brighton afternoon. The sun continued its slow descent toward evening, the light taking on that particular quality it acquired in late afternoon, rich and golden, and somehow sad, as if aware that the day was ending and trying to make its final hours as beautiful as possible. Eventually, Reverend Pemberton rose, his joints audibly protesting the movement. "I should return to the vicarage," he said. "My wife will be wondering if I've gotten lost among the gravestones, though I've been wandering among them for 30 years without mishap. It was a pleasure speaking with you, gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your stay in Brighton, and thank you again for your kindness to young Thomas. His family attends services here when they visit, so I'll likely see him Sunday if they're staying that long. I shall have the pleasure of knowing the full, true story when he tells it, before it becomes legend." He departed with a gentle wave, his figure receding along the gravel path toward the church and the vicarage that lay beyond it. Holmes and Watson remained on the bench a bit longer, reluctant to leave the peace they had found in this quiet place. "An interesting man," Holmes observed, faith maintained despite doubt, conviction tempered by humility, certainty about moral action coexisting with uncertainty about cosmic significance. The kind of religious figure one encounters too rarely, more concerned with living ethically than with doctrinal correctness, more interested in alleviating suffering than in judging sinners. Watson nodded, watching the vicar's diminishing figure. He reminded me of chaplains I knew in Afghanistan. Men who had seen terrible things, witnessed suffering that challenged any easy faith, but who continued to provide comfort and maintain hope, because the alternative was despair, and despair helped no one. There's a kind of courage in that, in continuing to believe or act as if one believes even when belief is difficult. They rose finally, their bodies stiff from sitting, and made their way back through the churchyard toward the iron gate and the street beyond. As they left, Watson glanced back once at the graves, at Margaret Ashford's stone with its epitaph about bringing light, at all the others who had lived and died and been remembered or forgotten according to their actions, and the memories of those who survived them. The afternoon was advancing toward evening now, the day past its peak, but not yet surrendering to night. Brighton beckoned with its remaining attractions, its promise of dinner and music, and the simple pleasure of walking by the sea as the light faded. But Watson found he was carrying something away from the churchyard beyond simple rest, a renewed sense of the continuity of human life, of the connections that persisted despite death and time, of the quiet heroisms that went mostly unnoticed, but that formed the actual foundation of society, more important than any grand achievement or celebrated success. "Come," Holmes said, noting Watson's contemplative expression. "Let us return to the promenade and see what the evening brings. The day has been full of small discoveries and unexpected conversations. I suspect Brighton has more to offer before we retire for the night." And so they walked back down the hill toward the sea, toward the sounds of humanity at leisure, toward whatever remained of this day that had begun with fog-shrouded London, and had transformed into something quite different, quite peaceful, quite valuable in ways neither of them had anticipated when they had made the decision to leave Baker Street behind for a few days of seaside air and gentle mysteries. The late afternoon had transformed Brighton's promenade into something softer, more intimate than the brilliant bustle of midday. The sun, now descending toward the horizon with the unhurried grace of something that had performed this ritual countless times and knew its role perfectly, cast long shadows that stretched eastward, turning ordinary people into elongated versions of themselves, making the whole scene feel slightly unreal, slightly magical, as if the boundary between waking and dreaming had grown permeable in the golden light. Holmes and Watson emerged from the quiet streets of residential Brighton back onto the seafront, and the contrast was immediate and pleasant. The crowds had thinned considerably as families retreated for early suppers and rest, but those who remained seemed to move with a different quality of purpose, slower, more contemplative, as if the approaching evening had granted permission to pause, to simply be present without the urgency that characterized daytime activity. The sea itself had changed with the light. Where it had been bright blue and grey in the morning, almost cheerful in its constant motion, it now took on shades of amber and rose gold, reflecting the descending sun in patterns that shifted with each wave, each breath of wind. The water looked almost gentle now, despite the fact that its power remained unchanged, its depths no less dangerous, its indifference to human life no less complete. But the light lied beautifully, suggesting warmth and welcome, where cold and peril actually existed. "Look," Watson said, pointing toward a section of the beach where a small crowd had gathered. "Something's happening down there." They moved to the railing and peered down to the pebbled shore, where perhaps 20 people stood in a loose semicircle, their attention focused on something Watson could not quite make out from this angle. Then the crowd shifted slightly, and he saw Thomas, the boy from that morning, standing with his ear trumpet pressed to his ear, his face animated with an expression of pure concentration and joy. His grandfather stood nearby, along with a woman who could only be Thomas's mother, young, perhaps 30, with the same wiry build as her son, and a face that showed the lines of someone who had worked hard and worried much, but had not yet lost the capacity for happiness. "Shall we?" Holmes asked, already moving toward the nearest set of steps that led down to the beach. Watson followed, their feet crunching on the pebbles as they descended, the stones shifting and rolling beneath their weight with that peculiar instability that made walking on Brighton's beach feel slightly precarious, as if one were constantly on the verge of losing balance without ever quite falling. As they approached, Thomas saw them, and his face broke into a grin of recognition and delight. He waved enthusiastically, nearly dropping his precious ear trumpet in his excitement, then thought better of such carelessness and carefully adjusted his grip before waving again more cautiously. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Come and hear, come and listen." They joined the gathered crowd, and Watson realized what was happening. Thomas was describing what he heard through his ear trumpet, not just the sounds themselves, but what they meant to him, what they made him feel, translating his auditory experience into words so that others might understand, might share in his joy, even if they could not hear precisely what he heard. "The waves," Thomas was saying, his eyes closed in concentration, the trumpet still pressed to his ear. "They sound like breathing, but huge, like a giant sleeping, and every breath moves the whole ocean. And underneath that, there's smaller sounds, little splashes and trickles, like the sea is whispering secrets to the stones. And the gulls, they're not just screeching, they're talking to each other, arguing maybe, or gossiping, the way ladies do at the market, when they think no one's listening." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the small crowd, and Thomas opened his eyes, pleased with the reaction, clearly enjoying his role as interpreter of the sea's voice. His mother stood close by, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her face showing such pride and love that Watson felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. This was what he had worked and saved for, what she had sacrificed to give her son, not just the ability to hear, but this moment, this experience of sharing his joy with others, of being the center of positive attention, of having something valuable to offer simply by describing his experience. "And if I turn this way," Thomas continued, rotating to face along the shore, "I can hear the pier, the wood creaking as the waves push against it, like it's complaining about having to hold still when everything around it is moving. And there's music, faint, but there, coming from somewhere up on the promenade. Someone playing piano, I think, though I'm not sure. It's all mixed together, all the sounds, but if I concentrate, I can pull them apart like threads in cloth, all woven together, but each one separate too." "That's remarkably poetic," said a woman in the crowd, an elderly lady with silver hair and an accent that suggested education and refinement. "Young man, you have a gift for description. Have you considered writing down your observations? They would make lovely reading." Thomas looked simultaneously pleased and embarrassed by the attention. "I'm not much good at writing, ma'am. My spelling is terrible, and my hand gets tired quick. But I like talking about what I hear. Most people don't really listen, I think. They hear things, but they don't listen properly, don't notice all the little sounds hiding inside the big ones." His mother spoke then, her voice carrying the softer tones of working-class London, but clear and pleasant despite its lack of formal education. "He's always been like that, even before the trumpet. Had to watch. Everything so careful, notice everything, because he couldn't hear properly. Now he can hear, he notices sounds the same way, every little detail, nothing missed. I tell him he'd make a fine detective, like in the stories, noticing things other people miss." Holmes stepped forward slightly, and Thomas's face lit up again with recognition. "Mr. Holmes, you came back. Did you hear me describing the sounds? I've been practicing all afternoon, trying to hear everything, remember everything, so I can tell Mum about it properly when we're back in London and I can't hear the sea any more." "You're doing admirably," Holmes assured him. "Your descriptions are quite vivid and demonstrate excellent observational skills. Your mother is quite right. That attention to detail, that ability to notice and remember small things that others might overlook, those are precisely the qualities that make a good detective, or a good scientist, or artist, or any profession that requires careful attention to the world." Thomas practically glowed with the praise, standing a bit straighter, his grip on the ear trumpet becoming almost protective. Watson moved to stand beside the boy's mother, extending his hand in introduction. "Dr. John Watson, I don't believe we were properly introduced this morning, though I had the pleasure of helping Mr. Holmes search for your son's ear trumpet." She took his hand, her grip firm despite her small stature, her palm rough with the calluses of someone who worked with their hands for long hours. "Sarah Whitmore, sir, and I can't thank you enough, both of you. When Thomas realized he'd lost the trumpet, I thought my heart would break. Took me near 6 months to save for it, and more than that, it would have broken his heart to lose it so soon after getting it, and on the day I'd promised him for so long. You saved more than a brass trumpet. You saved his joy, and his faith that good things don't just disappear the moment you stop paying attention." There was something in her voice that suggested she was speaking from deeper experience than just a lost ear trumpet, some history of good things, indeed disappearing when attention wavered, when vigilance slipped, even for a moment. Watson thought of what the grandfather had mentioned that morning, the husband with a drinking problem and temper, the decision to leave, the years of single parenthood and financial struggle that followed. This woman had learned hard lessons about loss, and had worked desperately to give her son a different experience, a world where precious things could be temporarily misplaced, but ultimately recovered, where joy was not inevitably followed by sorrow. "We were glad to help," Watson said simply. "And may I say, you have raised a remarkable young man. His enthusiasm and attention to detail are truly impressive." Sarah's eyes grew bright with tears she refused to let fall. "He's the best thing I ever did," she said quietly. "Everything else in my life I made. Mistakes, bad choices, wrong turns. But Thomas, he came out perfect despite everything, and I've tried my best to keep him that way, to give him chances I never had, to protect him from." She trailed off, apparently deciding that elaborating on what she was protecting him from would be inappropriate for a first conversation with a gentleman. But Watson understood. Protect him from violence, from poverty's worst deprivations, from the belief that his circumstances were all he deserved, or could ever hope for. Protect him from becoming like his father, from inheriting anger or despair, from accepting limitation as inevitable. It was what every parent tried to do, Watson supposed, but what parents in Sarah Whitmore's circumstances had to work so much harder to accomplish, with so many fewer resources, against so many more obstacles. Thomas had moved closer to the water now, his small crowd of listeners following at a respectful distance, all of them drawn into his narrative, his translation of the sea's voice into human language. The boy was completely absorbed in his task, moving the trumpet slightly to capture different angles of sound, his face showing concentration and delight in equal measure. When the waves pull back, he was explaining, the stones make this rattling sound, like marbles rolling in a tin can, but softer, and you can hear individual stones too, if you listen very careful. Each one moving against the others, thousands and thousands of tiny sounds that add up to one big sound. It's like how a crowd sounds from far away, just general noise. But if you get close, you can hear individual voices, individual words. The sea is like that. Up on the promenade, it's just the sound of waves, but down here with the trumpet, I can hear all the little pieces that make up the whole. Extraordinary, murmured a gentleman in the crowd, a man whose expensive clothing and cultured accent marked him as far removed from Sarah Whitmore's social sphere, yet who seemed genuinely moved by the boy's performance. I've lived in Brighton for 20 years and walked this beach hundreds of times, but I don't believe I've ever truly listened to it the way this young man is teaching us to listen. Holmes had remained somewhat apart from the crowd, leaning against one of the wooden groins that extended down into the water, his expression thoughtful as he watched Thomas perform his translations. Watson joined him, leaving Sarah to receive compliments about her son from the other observers, to experience for a few moments the pride of having her hard work and sacrifice recognized by strangers who had no obligation to notice or care. "He's quite remarkable," Watson said quietly. "The disability that might have isolated him has instead sharpened his observational skills, made him notice things that people with normal hearing simply take for granted. And his ability to articulate what he hears, to make others understand and appreciate it, that's a genuine talent, not just childish enthusiasm." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "I meant what I said earlier. He has the makings of an excellent detective, or any profession requiring careful observation and analysis. The question is whether he will have opportunity to develop those talents, or whether poverty and limited access to education will channel him into manual labor that wastes his potential. That is the great tragedy of England's class system. Not that some are born to privilege and others to poverty, but that talent is distributed equally across all classes, while opportunity is not. How many potential scientists or artists or thinkers are currently working in factories or on docks or in service positions, their abilities never recognized or cultivated, because their circumstances provide no avenue for development? It was a topic Watson had heard Holmes address before, usually late at night, when cocaine or exhaustion had loosened the careful controls he usually maintained over his opinions. For someone who could appear cold and calculating, who claimed to care only about intellectual puzzles rather than social justice, Holmes harbored surprisingly radical views about class and opportunity, about the waste inherent in a system that allocated life chances based on birth rather than merit. Perhaps, Watson suggested carefully, if his mother were to know about educational opportunities, scholarships for bright children from working-class backgrounds, she might be able to secure something for him. There are charitable organizations, are there not, that assist promising students? There are, Holmes confirmed, though they are few, and the competition is fierce. But it would be worth investigating. If young Thomas continues to develop his observational and analytical skills, he might indeed qualify for such assistance. He paused, then added with uncharacteristic warmth, "I could make inquiries, perhaps, write some letters on his behalf to organizations I am aware of through my work. A recommendation from someone with a certain reputation might carry weight, open doors that would otherwise remain closed. Watson felt a surge of affection for his friend, for this man who claimed emotional detachment, yet consistently demonstrated deep concern for those he encountered, particularly those whose potential was being wasted by circumstances beyond their control. That would be remarkably generous of you. It would be remarkably practical, Holmes corrected, though his tone suggested he was not as indifferent as he pretended. Talent should be cultivated wherever it is found, not left to wither for lack of opportunity. That benefits no one, not the individual whose potential is wasted, not the society that loses their potential contributions. Enlightened self-interest, Watson, nothing more. They were interrupted by Thomas, who had finished his performance, and was approaching them with that peculiar combination of shyness and boldness that characterized children who were naturally reserved, but had been given reason to feel confident. His mother followed a few steps behind, her expression suggesting she was about to encourage her son to thank them again, to display the manners she had worked hard to instill despite their difficult circumstances. "Mr. Holmes," Thomas said, coming to a stop before them and executing a small bow that would have been comical except for the seriousness with which he performed it. "I wanted to thank you again properly for finding my trumpet. Mum says I should tell you that if you ever need anything at all, our family owes you a debt, and we always pay our debts." Holmes crouched down to the boy's level, as he had that morning, bringing himself to eye level rather than looming above. "Thomas, you owe me nothing. Finding your trumpet took perhaps an hour of my time and required no great skill, merely systematic searching. The joy it has given you this afternoon, and the joy you have given to all these people through your descriptions of what you hear, that is payment far in excess of any debt. You have taught us all to listen more carefully, to appreciate sounds we normally take for granted. That is a genuine gift." He paused, then continued in a more serious tone. "But if you wish to repay me, I shall ask something of you. Continue to develop your skills of observation and description. Pay attention to the world around you. Notice the details that others miss. Practice putting your observations into words. Do well at your studies, particularly in subjects that teach you to think carefully and express yourself clearly. And when you are older, use those skills to help others, as I was able to help you today by finding your lost trumpet. That would be payment in full with interest." Thomas nodded solemnly, clearly taking this instruction as seriously as a military order or religious commandment. "I promise, Mr. Holmes, I'll pay attention and study hard and help people when I can, just like you do." Sarah had been listening to this exchange with an expression that suggested she was struggling to maintain her composure. When Thomas finished speaking, she placed both hands on his shoulders and said, her voice thick with emotion, "What do you say to these kind gentlemen, Thomas?" "Thank you," the boy said, looking between Holmes and Watson with such earnest gratitude that Watson felt his own eyes begin to sting with unexpected tears. "Thank you for finding my trumpet, and for being kind, and for treating me like I matter." "You do matter," Watson said firmly, his doctor's voice asserting itself, the voice he used when making diagnoses or offering prognoses, when conveying important truths that needed to be believed. "Every person matters, regardless of their circumstances or abilities. Never doubt that." The crowd had begun to disperse now, the impromptu performance concluded. People drifting back toward the promenade and their evening. Plans. The sun was definitely setting now, its lower edge touching the horizon, the sky taking on those spectacular colours that only occurred at this time of day, deep oranges and purples and roses, shades that seemed too vivid to be real, but somehow were, a daily reminder that nature's palette far exceeded anything human artists could imagine or reproduce. Sarah and her father-in-law prepared to leave as well, gathering their few belongings, making sure Thomas had his trumpet secured safely in the inner pocket of his jacket, where it couldn't be easily lost or stolen. They said their farewells, Sarah grasping Watson's hand once more, and Holmes's as well, her grip conveying what words probably could not. Gratitude, certainly, but also something like wonder, that strangers had been so kind, that the world had shown her family gentleness, rather than the harshness she had probably come to expect. Holmes and Watson watched them climb the steps back to the promenade, the small family reunited for this brief Brighton holiday, storing up memories to sustain them through the months of London life that awaited them. Thomas turned back once when he reached the top of the steps, waving with his free hand, his other hand pressed against the pocket that held his precious trumpet. "Well," Watson said after they had disappeared from view, "that was unexpectedly moving. A simple case of a lost object, and yet it seems to have resonated far beyond its immediate resolution." "The simple cases often do," Holmes replied, straightening from the groin he had been leaning against. "Grand conspiracies and elaborate crimes make for dramatic stories, but it is the small human dramas, the lost trumpets and broken hearts and unexpected kindnesses, that actually form the texture of life, the daily reality that most people experience. We are fortunate to have encountered this one, and to have been able to help, even in a modest way." They turned and walked slowly along the beach, their feet crunching on the pebbles, the sound mingling with the sea's constant voice. The evening was fully upon them now, the sun sinking below the horizon with the last of its golden light, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky overhead. Brighton's gas lamps were being lit along the promenade, creating a string of warm glowing points that outlined the shore, marking the boundary between land and sea, between the human world and the natural one that existed beyond human control or comprehension. And above it all, the eternal sound of waves, speaking their ancient language, offering their timeless comfort, reminding all who listened that they had been here before humans built cities or invented language, and would remain long after both had passed into memory and then into oblivion. The evening descended over Brighton with the gentle inevitability of a curtain falling on a play's final act, transforming the town once again into something softer, more intimate than its daylight self. The gas lamps along the promenade had been fully lit now, their warm glow creating pools of amber light, separated by stretches of shadow, so that walking the seafront became a journey through alternating brightness and darkness, revelation and mystery. The crowds had thinned to a scattering of evening strollers, couples walking arm in arm, elderly gentlemen taking constitutional walks before bed, the occasional solitary figure standing at the railing and gazing out at the invisible sea, its presence marked now only by sound and the faint phosphorescence of foam where waves broke against the shore. Holmes and Watson had climbed back up from the beach, their clothes bearing traces of sand and salt, their faces still warm from the day's accumulated sun. Neither spoke immediately about dinner or lodgings or any practical concern. Instead, by unspoken agreement, they simply walked, following the promenade's curve, letting the evening unfold around them without attempting to direct or hurry its progression. The music that had characterized the afternoon had largely ceased, the buskers and performers having collected their earnings and departed for their own suppers and rest. But from somewhere nearby came the sound of a piano, its notes carrying clearly in the evening air. Someone playing in a hotel or boarding house, perhaps, their music escaping through open windows to become part of Brighton's evening soundtrack. The melody was melancholy, but not sad, something classical that Watson half recognized but could not name, a piece that seemed perfectly suited to this transitional hour between day and night, activity and rest, wakefulness and sleep. Chopin, Holmes murmured, identifying what Watson's mind had been reaching for. Nocturne in E-flat major, if I'm not mistaken. Appropriate for the hour and beautifully played, someone with genuine skill rather than merely competent technique. They paused, standing in one of the pools of lamplight, listening to the piano merge with the sound of waves, two very different kinds of music that somehow complemented rather than competed with each other. Watson found himself thinking about Thomas and his descriptions of sound, his ability to hear individual components within complex auditory landscapes. The boy would appreciate this, he thought. The way the piano's melody wove through the sea's percussion, the way both sounds occupied the same space without diminishing each other, each adding depth and dimension to the other. I meant what I said earlier, Holmes said quietly, his eyes fixed on the dark expanse of water beyond the railing. About writing letters on the boy's behalf. He has genuine potential, and it would be a tragedy for it to be wasted simply because his mother lacks connections or knowledge of educational opportunities. I shall make inquiries when we return to London, see what scholarships or charitable programs might be available for a bright working-class child with disabilities who has learned to compensate and excel despite his challenges. Watson felt warmth spread through his chest, that particular pleasure that came from witnessing Holmes's better nature assert itself, from seeing past the carefully constructed facade of detachment to the genuine compassion that existed beneath. "You are a better man than you allow the world to believe," he said simply. Holmes made a dismissive sound, but he did not deny it, which was as close to acknowledgement as he was likely to come. "I am a practical man who dislikes waste, wasted talent, wasted potential, wasted human capital, all economically inefficient and socially counterproductive. If I can spend a few hours writing letters that might redirect a life onto a more productive trajectory, it seems a reasonable investment of time." "Of course," Watson agreed, allowing his friend the fiction of pure rationality, the pretense that kindness was merely enlightened self-interest. They both knew better, but Holmes needed to maintain his self-image as someone guided only by logic, and Watson was happy to help him preserve it. They resumed walking, moving now away from the promenade's main section toward the quieter stretches where fewer lamps had been lit, and the darkness pressed closer. Here the stars became more visible, no longer washed out by artificial light, and Watson found himself looking upward at their scattered profusion, those distant suns that had been burning for unimaginable spans of time, whose light had begun its journey years or centuries before, and was only now reaching his eyes in this moment on this evening in this specific location on Earth's surface. The stars look different here, he observed, brighter somehow, though I suppose that's merely the absence of London's smoke and fog. But still, there's something about seeing them over water that makes them seem more significant, perhaps, more real. The sea provides a different kind of darkness than land, Holmes said, following Watson's gaze upward. Land darkness is interrupted by trees, buildings, variations in terrain, but sea darkness is absolute, unbroken except by the stars themselves. It creates a sense of vast emptiness that forces perspective, reminds us of our insignificance in the cosmic scheme. Some people find that terrifying, others find it oddly comforting. "Which do you find it?" Watson asked, curious about his friend's response. Holmes considered for a moment, his profile sharp against the darkness, illuminated periodically as they passed beneath the occasional lamp. "Comforting," he said finally. "Human concerns seem less weighty when viewed against such scale. The crimes we investigate, the mysteries we solve, the small dramas of human existence. They matter to the individuals involved, certainly, and I do not dismiss their importance. But the universe cares nothing for any of it. The stars will continue burning, regardless of whether justice is served, or criminals are caught or lost, ere trumpets are found. There is freedom in that indifference, permission to do our best without the pressure of cosmic significance. We act because we choose to, because it seems right to us, not because the universe demands or even notices our actions." It was as close to philosophy as Holmes typically allowed himself, this acknowledgement of humanity's place in an indifferent universe, this articulation of ethics divorced from divine command or cosmic purpose. Watson understood it, even shared it to some degree, though his own worldview retained more space for meaning and purpose, for the possibility that actions rippled outward in ways not immediately visible, that kindness mattered even when unobserved, that love and sacrifice and beauty had significance beyond their immediate effects. But he did not argue the point. This was not the evening for theological or philosophical debate. This was the evening for walking by the sea, for listening to piano music carry through the darkness, for feeling the day's gentle completion and allowing it to settle into memory. They had reached a section of the promenade where a row of benches faced the sea, positioned to provide optimal viewing of the water and horizon. Holmes and Watson selected one and sat, their bodies tired now from the day's walking and climbing, grateful for rest. The bench's wood was cool against their backs, worn smooth by countless previous occupants, and Watson imagined all the people who had sat here before them, lovers and families and solitary thinkers, tourists and residents, the happy and the sorrowful, each bringing their own concerns and perspectives to this spot, each looking out at the same eternal sea and finding in it whatever they needed to find. From their elevated position, they could see lights from ships far out in the channel, distant points of illumination that marked the passage of vessels travelling between England and the continent, carrying cargo and passengers, maintaining the networks of trade and communication that connected nations and allowed civilization to function. Watson had travelled extensively during his military service, had seen different lands and cultures, had experienced the strange sensation of being far from home while still being fundamentally English, carrying London inside him, like a seed that no amount of distance could erase. But Brighton felt different from those foreign places. It was still England, still recognisably home, yet distant enough from London to provide perspective, to allow him to see his usual life from outside its daily immersion. The fog and darkness of Baker Street, the parade of desperate clients and criminal ingenuity, the late nights and irregular hours and constant stimulation. All of it felt far away now, part of a different world that existed parallel to this one, but could not quite penetrate its boundaries. "I am glad we came," Watson said into the comfortable silence. I had not realized how much I needed this stepping away, this breathing of different air, this reminder that life contains moments of simple peace alongside its complications and darkness. "As am I," Holmes agreed. "London has its pull, its inexhaustible supply of puzzles and problems. But there is value in periodic withdrawal, in allowing the mind to rest and the spirit to regenerate, I suppose, though that sounds more mystical than I intend. Perhaps simply, there is value in doing nothing of particular consequence, in experiencing beauty without attempting to analyze it, in helping a child find a lost trumpet without it needing to be part of some larger conspiracy or criminal enterprise." Watson smiled at that. The case of the missing ear trumpet, not quite the same ring as the Hound of the Baskervilles or the Sign of 4. "No," Holmes chuckled, "but possibly more valuable, in its way. Grand cases make for better stories, certainly, but I suspect we shall both remember young Thomas and his joy at recovering his trumpet longer and more fondly than many of our more dramatic investigations. There is something about simple goodness, simply expressed, that lodges more deeply in memory than complexity, however impressive." They sat in companionable silence for several more minutes, watching the darkness deepen, listening to the sea's endless conversation with the shore. The piano music had stopped, its player presumably retiring for the evening, but the absence of melody only made the sea's voice more prominent, more insistent, as if it had been waiting patiently for the human sounds to cease so it could reclaim its acoustic territory. Eventually, practical concerns reasserted themselves. They had eaten nothing since their fish and chips at lunch, and Watson's stomach was beginning to make its hunger known through gentle protests. Holmes, who could go remarkable lengths of time without food when absorbed in a case, seemed to notice his own hunger at the same moment, and they rose by mutual agreement to seek dinner. Mrs. Wickham's establishment, they remembered, served dinner at 6, and they had certainly missed that appointed hour by several hours. But Brighton was a tourist town, accustomed to accommodating irregular schedules and late arrivals, and they found without difficulty a small restaurant still serving evening meals. A cosy place with perhaps 10 tables, warm lighting that created an intimate atmosphere, and smells emanating from the kitchen that promised hearty, unpretentious food, prepared with care. The meal that followed was exactly what the evening required: simple, satisfying, consumed without hurry. Roasted chicken with herbs, potatoes cooked until their exteriors were crispy and their interiors soft, vegetables that had been treated with respect rather than boiled into submission, and bread still warm enough that butter melted immediately upon contact. They ate steadily, speaking little, their attention focused on the food and the pleasant fatigue that comes from a day well spent. The restaurant's other patrons were few at this hour, an elderly couple celebrating some private occasion, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but their expressions suggesting contentment, and a family of 4 whose children were drooping with exhaustion but fighting sleep with the determination of the young who believe they might miss something important if they surrender to rest. Watching the family, Watson found his thoughts returning once more to Thomas and Sarah Whitmore, to the grandfather who had brought them to Brighton for this special day. He imagined them now, possibly back in their own lodgings, or perhaps taking one final walk along the promenade, Thomas, with his hand protectively over the pocket containing his ear trumpet, his mind full of the sounds he had heard, and the descriptions he had given, the attention he had received, the validation that his observations were valuable, and his experience worthy of sharing. The mother will remember this day for the rest of her life, Watson said quietly, more to himself than to Holmes. Not just because her son recovered his trumpet, but because strangers were kind, because the day that might have been ruined by loss and disappointment became instead a day of joy and validation. Those memories sustain us, I think, during harder times. They become evidence that the world contains goodness, that help sometimes appears when needed, that disasters can be averted, and joy restored. Holmes nodded, finishing his meal and pushing his plate away with the satisfied gesture of someone whose hunger had been adequately addressed. And young Thomas will remember the detective who found his trumpet and told him he had potential, that his observations were valuable. Children take such validations seriously. Allow them to shape their self-perception in ways that persist into adulthood. I hope he does indeed develop his talents, find opportunities to use them. But even if he does not, even if circumstance channels him into ordinary work and modest life, he will carry with him the knowledge that someone thought him capable of more. That knowledge has value independent of whether it leads to material success. They paid their bill and emerged back into the evening, which had completed its transition into night. The promenade was nearly empty now, most visitors having retired to their lodgings, the entertainment venues having closed, the town settling into the quieter rhythms of darkness and rest. The gas lamps still burned, maintaining their vigil, and the sea continued its eternal work, but human activity had withdrawn, surrendering Brighton to the elements and to those few souls who preferred night walking to sleep. Holmes and Watson made their way slowly back toward Mrs. Wickham's boarding house, their steps unhurried, their conversation sporadic. Both men tired now in the pleasant way that comes from physical exertion and fresh air, rather than the draining exhaustion that follows stress or overwork. The day had been long, beginning with their early morning departure from fog-bound London, continuing through their arrival in Brighton, the discovery and recovery of Thomas's trumpet, the afternoon's explorations, the evening's reflections. And yet it felt complete, rather than merely ended, as if it had accomplished something beyond the simple passage of hours. They reached their lodgings and climbed the stairs to their adjacent rooms, the boarding house quiet around them, other guests already retired, or at least withdrawn into their private spaces. At the door to his room, Watson paused, turning to his friend. "Thank you," he said simply, "for suggesting this trip, for agreeing to come, for helping that boy this morning even though we were supposedly on holiday from helping people. Thank you for being exactly who you are, even when you pretend to be someone else." Holmes looked slightly uncomfortable, as he always did, with direct expressions of sentiment, but he accepted the thanks with a small nod. "Sleep well, Watson. Tomorrow we have another day of Brighton to experience, more sea air to breathe, more simple mysteries to encounter or avoid as circumstances dictate. But tonight, rest. You have certainly earned it." They parted, each entering his own room, and Watson moved immediately to his window, drawn once more by the view of the sea that had captivated him since their arrival. The water was barely visible now in the darkness, marked primarily by the white foam of breaking waves and the faint phosphorescence that sometimes appeared in disturbed water. But its sound was constant, that ancient rhythm that predated human language and would outlast human civilization, the heartbeat of a planet that was mostly water, mostly ocean, mostly this endless movement of waves, approaching and retreating, world without end. Watson stood at the window for several minutes, his hands resting on the sill, his mind drifting in that pleasant space between thought and non-thought that preceded sleep. The day played back in fragments, Thomas's tear-stained face transforming into joy, Sarah Whitmore's rough hands and grateful grip, the old vicar's quiet faith, the taste of fish and chips consumed at a checkered table, the piano music merging with wave sounds, Holmes crouching to speak with a child at eye level, the stars over water, the eternal indifference of the universe balanced against the temporary but genuine kindnesses of individual humans. It had been, Watson reflected, a nearly perfect day. Not perfect in the sense of being without complication or small difficulties. Thomas had lost his trumpet, after all, had suffered real distress before it was found. But perfect in the sense of being complete, of containing both shadow and light, of presenting problems that could be solved and joy that could be shared, of revealing the world as it actually was, rather than as one might wish it to be. Difficult, but not impossible, often harsh, but occasionally gentle, full of suffering, but also full of beauty and unexpected kindness. He moved away from the window finally, preparing for bed with the slow, deliberate movements of someone thoroughly tired. The sheets, when he slipped between them, were cool and clean, carrying that faint scent of lavender that suggested Mrs. Wickham believed in proper laundering and understood the small details that distinguished adequate lodgings from comfortable ones. Watson's last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was of the sea, still there beyond his window, still performing its ancient work, waves approaching and retreating, speaking in the voice that Thomas had heard through his brass trumpet and translated into poetry, the voice that humanity had been listening to since the first humans stood upright and walked to the water's edge, the voice that said, "I was here before you, and I will be here after you, and in between, while you exist, I will continue doing what I have always done, what I will always do, moving with the moon, moving with the tides, moving with time itself, eternal and indifferent, and somehow, despite that indifference, offering comfort to those willing to listen." The sea sang him to sleep, as it had sung countless others to sleep across millennia, as it would continue singing long after Watson and Holmes and Thomas and Sarah and all the people who had walked Brighton's promenade that day had passed into memory, and then into forgetting, as all individual humans eventually did, their stories absorbed back into the larger story of humanity, which was itself merely a brief chapter in the even larger story of Earth, which was itself merely one small planet circling one ordinary star in one average galaxy, in a universe so vast that comprehension failed, and only wonder remained. Watson slept, and the sea sang, and Brighton rested under its scattered stars, and somewhere in the town a boy clutched a brass ear trumpet, even in sleep, holding fast to the thing that allowed him to hear the world's voice, to translate its sounds into meaning, to share that meaning with others, and in sharing, to remind them all that listening, true, careful, attentive listening, was itself a form of love, a way of honouring existence simply by noticing it, by paying attention, by bearing witness to the infinite small beauties that filled every moment of every day for those with ears to hear and hearts to understand. The night deepened, the waves continued their work, and in rooms scattered throughout Brighton, people dreamed their dreams, stored their memories, prepared themselves for tomorrow's continuation of the story that never really ended, but simply changed its characters and settings while remaining fundamentally the same. The story of humans attempting to live well, to find meaning, to create joy, to offer and receive kindness, to stand at the edge of things and look out at infinity, and somehow find the courage to turn back toward the ordinary world and keep living, keep trying, keep hoping, keep listening for the voices, whether of the sea or of each other, that reminded them they were not alone, had never been alone, would never be alone so long as the world continued turning and the waves continued singing, and small brass trumpets could capture those songs and translate them into language that even the deafest heart could understand. Peace descended. Sleep claimed its territory. And Brighton, that democratic resort, that transformed fishing village, that place where all classes mingled in pursuit of pleasure and rest and the ancient human need to stand beside the infinite and feel simultaneously humbled and exalted, settled into its nightly rhythms, preparing to wake again at dawn and begin the cycle anew, offering to tomorrow's visitors the same gifts it had offered today: sea air and sunshine, pastries and music, simple mysteries and simpler resolutions, the chance to step outside ordinary life for a brief interlude and discover that even ordinary life, properly observed and appreciated, contained extraordinary grace. The story ended where all good stories end, not with dramatic conclusion, but with gentle completion. Not with answers to every question, but with peace about the questions that remained. Not with certainty, but with acceptance. Not with the false comfort of permanent happiness, but with the true comfort of having experienced for a little while genuine joy and having shared that joy with others who needed it as much as we did ourselves. The Seaside interlude was complete. The sea's voice had been heard, lost, and recovered. And two men from London, along with a boy and his family, had been reminded that the world, for all its darkness and difficulty, still contained light enough to see by, warmth enough to rest in, and kindness enough to sustain us through whatever came next. Sleep well, Brighton. Sleep well, all who rest within your boundaries tonight. The morning will come, as it always does, and with it new possibilities, new mysteries, new chances to listen carefully and act kindly. And remember that we are here for such a brief time that every moment of genuine connection, every act of unexpected grace, every recovered joy becomes precious beyond measure, worthy of being honoured, remembered, and when possible, repeated. The sea sang, the stars watched, and peace, that rarest and most valuable of human experiences, settled over Brighton like a benediction, like a promise, like the final note of a beautiful song that would echo in memory long after the music itself had faded into silence.